Hello and welcome to this clean, historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. The False Bride's Secret by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1. 5 Points, New York, 1877. Are the windows iced up already? Nancy Smith rubbed her hands together, trying to get warm, and leaned closer to Tilly, her best friend. They sure are. Tilly took a deep breath and huffed on the glass pane before scraping the ice away with the corner of her apron. Once a small area had been cleared, she lifted Nancy up so she could peer out onto the streets below. Can you see anything? The tree is up, Nancy cried, pointing to something in the distance. Look, there are glass baubles and tinsel. I think there are even some ribbons tied on the branches and a star at the top. Her voice was trembling with excitement, but also underlaid with wistfulness. I think it's the prettiest Christmas tree I've ever seen in my whole life. Do you think Matron would let us visit? Let you visit? Certainly not, girls. What a ridiculous idea. Tilly almost dropped Nancy as a bony hand clamped her shoulder, the fingers digging in. It was Miss Fenton, matron of St. Bartholomew's Orphanage, and the most feared woman of 5 Points, New York. The children who resided there used to whisper. What do you think you're doing standing idle here in the dormitory when there's work to be getting on with, Matilda Harvey? And haven't I told you before that you're becoming a bad influence on young Nancy? Miss Fenton's thin lips were pursed with annoyance as she regarded 16-year-old Tilly and 10-year-old Nancy. The two girls were inseparable in spite of her best attempts to keep them apart. Sorry, matron, Tilly said hastily. She'd had years of practice placating Miss Fenton and knew that there was no point trying to fib her way out of it. Nancy has been looking forward to the festive season for months, and I heard a rumor that there would be a Christmas tree in the market square this year. Do you think Mr. Walsh would let us all see it? I promise I'll keep the little ones in good order. We could even offer to work longer hours for a week, so we don't fall behind on any chores. It would be such a wonderful thing for the younger children to do, don't you think? Matron's first instinct was to say no immediately, but then she remembered what Mr. Walsh, the owner of the orphanage, had said to her on his last visit. We must show the folks who make charitable donations that the children are well cared for, matron. Even if it's just for show, he'd added with a dry chuckle. Can't have them thinking their money is used to feather my own nest now, can we? Matron dabbed a voluminous handkerchief at her nose, which always seemed to start running at the first sign of winter. The thought of shepherding the children in her care to the square was already giving her a headache. But she supposed their patrons would feel a warm glow of satisfaction to see them gazing up at the Christmas tree. It might even inspire them to contribute more money for a hot meal on Christmas Day itself, which would please Mr. Walsh. He always complained that the children ate more than they should during the colder months. I'll consider it, she said reluctantly, giving Tilly a sharp nod. But I'll expect everyone to be ahead with the chores, and you'd better make sure everyone's clothes look presentable. I ain't having the townsfolk whispering about me not doing my job properly. Is that clear? Oh, thank you, matron. Nancy flung her arms around Miss Fenton's waist, carried away with enthusiasm before remembering that such a display of emotion was unseemly. The little ones will be so excited, and it's all thanks to you. Never mind that. Just hurry up and get to the laundry, Nancy. Remember, I won't let you go unless all the washing is done exactly to my liking. As Miss Fenton watched the two girls hurrying away, chattering loudly with excitement, she sighed loudly. Now that Tilly was almost 16, her natural beauty was becoming more evident, and she was worried that she might attract unwelcome attention in the outside world. That really would be most inconvenient, she muttered to herself. Kind-hearted, hard-working Tilly was adored by the younger children. But more importantly, she was also a great help to her, doing the work of several maids and keeping many of the other orphans' spirits up. She was of an age where she should be going out to work, but Miss Fenton didn't want to lose her. She was far too useful in making her life easier. Make sure you walk in pairs and hold hands. Tilly had marshaled the children into a line, and there was a palpable hum of excited anticipation in the crisp evening air. It was a week since Miss Fenton had agreed that they could visit the Christmas tree, and the ground was covered with the first snow of the season. "I'm perishing cold," one of the boys complained. He stamped his feet. The shoes he was wearing were too small, but there weren't any others available. "I'm not even meant to be here. It's only because my ma got sick." He blinked his eyes rapidly, close to tears. "Hush, Jamie. If you grumble, we might not be allowed to go. You heard what Mr. Walsh said. He expects everyone to look happy and to sing loudly for the carols." Nancy jabbed him with her elbow and stifled a giggle as he pulled a face back at her. Tilly hurried over to them and straightened Jamie's coat. She bent down and rubbed his shoulders, trying to cheer him up and jolly him out of the forlorn look that so many of the children had when they first arrived. "I know you wish you had your own home to go to, but we're your family now, Jamie. Let's just enjoy this outing, shall we? Matron said we can have buttered baked potatoes when we get back." She lowered her voice. "I'll give you some of my potato, Jamie, to make up for it being your first Christmas here, all right?" The young boy shot her a grateful smile, and Nancy linked arms with him. "You'll soon get used to it. Don't worry," she said cheerily. "Tilly and I don't know any different, and it's not that bad as long as you keep in Matron's good books." A few minutes later, they filed out of the large gates and walked briskly toward the market square. As they rounded the corner, the children gasped. The Christmas tree twinkled with candles in the dusk, and snowflakes drifted down, adding a magical air to the evening. For the next half hour, they listened to the carol singers who were already gathered there. And then Mr. and Mrs. Walsh gave a gracious nod to show that the children were allowed to join in with the last few songs. As the younger children sang, Tilly couldn't help but look around at the bustling crowds in the square. There were elegantly dressed women with their maids doing some festive shopping, clerks with their collars turned up against the cold on their way home from work, and an array of other folks going about their business. She felt a tug of longing to be one of them. She had been at the orphanage for as long as she could remember. Matron said her parents had died when she was still just a baby, and ever since, she had wondered what it would be like to feel wanted, part of a proper family, with a cozy home to go back to on a winter's night. "This is the best outing I've ever had," Nancy said, looking up at Tilly with a wide smile. "When we have our own house together, and we're not at the orphanage anymore, we'll be able to do this every year, won't we? And then go to a tea room for hot chocolate and as much cake as we can eat." Suddenly, her favorite pastime of daydreaming about life after the orphanage was interrupted as she became aware of a gentleman at the edge of the crowd watching them intently. "Do you know him?" she asked, nudging Tilly. Tilly followed her gaze. The man had broad shoulders and a swarthy complexion, and his nose was crooked, as though he had been involved in many fights. She felt herself blush under his frank gaze, which he was making no attempt to hide. "I've never seen him before," she whispered. Nancy always told her she was pretty with her blonde, naturally curly hair and green eyes, but Tilly felt anything but. She had put her best gown on for the outing and draped her shawl over the places where it had been patched, but compared to the other young ladies strolling along the street in their elegant velvet dresses and fur-trimmed capes, she had never felt so dowdy. "Perhaps he's one of the patrons," she suggested. "I reckon he's sweet on you," Nancy muttered. A shadow crossed her face. "You won't leave me behind at St. Bartholomew's, will you, Tilly? You're the only family I have." She knew that Tilly would probably be sent into service soon to work for a wealthy family and was dreading it. "Of course not. I always said I would look after you, Nancy, even though we're not related by blood. You know you're like a sister to me, the only kin I have." She smiled down at the young girl. "Look, one of the church ladies is handing out peppermint candy. Why don't you take Jamie to get some?" Tilly smiled as the younger children politely accepted the rare treats, making sure they all managed to get their fair share, and said thank you. Out of the corner of her eye, she was surprised to see the man who had been watching her sidle up to Matron. He muttered something before jerking his head in her direction. What surprised her more was Matron's response. She patted her hair, and her cheeks turned pink. If Tilly didn't know better, it looked like the man was flirting with Miss Fenton. Her suspicions were confirmed when Tilly heard a tinkling laugh, and Matron beamed up at him. "Time to go home now," Matron said a few minutes later. She bustled toward Tilly. "Make sure everybody returns. The last thing we need is a runaway child. That wouldn't reflect very well on Mr. and Mrs. Walsh at all." Tilly did as she was told, and they trooped along the snowy sidewalk, arriving back at the gates of St. Bartholomew's all too soon. She was surprised to see that the strange man was walking some way behind them, still deep in conversation with Matron. It looked as though he was trying to persuade her to come around to a suggestion. At first, Matron shook her head vehemently, but a moment later, she was nodding happily, and the man strode away back toward town again. She wondered what they had been discussing, but put it from her mind as the children surged toward the dining hall for the promised hot dinner to warm up again. "Come to my office, please, Tilly." Tilly's heart sank at being summoned from her work in the laundry the following morning. Usually, it meant she had done something wrong, and she racked her brain trying to think what it might be. "Shut the door, please." Matron waited until they were alone and then gave Tilly a thin smile. "You're coming up for 16, Tilly, which means it's time for you to earn your keep." Tilly nodded cautiously. "Can I stay local, please, Miss Fenton? It's Nancy, you see. We're like family to each other, and I'd hate to leave her behind." Matron sat down behind her desk and sighed extravagantly. "I was worried you would find a reason to be awkward, Matilda. You can't expect to be treated differently from the others. Everyone else has to leave and go out to work. Mr. Walsh's reputation is at stake, you know. St. Bartholomew children are sought after as maids and factory workers because they do as they're told." "I know that, Matron, and I'm not afraid of hard work. It would be rather a shame to split you from Nancy, though." Matron looked thoughtful. "I have a suggestion that could work in your favor, but you have to keep it between us." She let her words hang between them. "Anything, Matron. I promised Nancy when she first arrived at the orphanage that I would look after her, and I don't want to break my promise." "Quite. Very commendable." A crafty look came over Matron's face. "You might have seen me talking to a gentleman of my acquaintance during the carol singing. Mr. Norman Coldwell is his name. He runs the Sailor's Rest Tavern, and he's looking for a hard-working young lady to help serve his customers. He's very particular about who he chooses to work there, and it just happens that you fit the bill perfectly. It's quite the honor to be chosen, Tilly, so you should be pleased that you came to his attention during the carol singing." Tilly nodded eagerly. She had spotted the tavern on the way to the market square. "If you're sure I'll be good enough, Matron?" "Thank you. I'd be ever so grateful. Will I have lodgings above the tavern? How will I still see Nancy?" Her mind buzzed with questions at this new change in her life, but Matron waved her hand dismissively. "What I've agreed with Mr. Coldwell is that you will continue with your work here during the day, and then you will work at the tavern in the evenings. You'll be paid, of course, and Nancy will still see you." She raised her eyebrows. "What do you say?" "Of course, Matron. I'll be sure to be very discreet." "That's settled, then." Matron stood up to indicate that the meeting was over. "You'll start next week. And remember, this is our little secret, Matilda. Mr. and Mrs. Walsh must never find out about it, all right? Otherwise, you'll be sent away to work as a maid in a different part of the country, and poor Nancy will be left all alone." Tilly hurried back to the laundry, eager to tell Nancy about her new arrangement. She knew she could trust her to keep the secret, especially if she explained that, for once, Matron had been kind enough to think of how she and Nancy could still be together. Working in a tavern? Nancy's eyes rounded with surprise as Tilly whispered her news while they fed the sopping sheets through the mangle. "Do you think that's safe with all those drunken men?" Tilly ignored her misgivings and nodded. "I got the impression that Mr. Coldwell is Matron's friend. She told me there are several other ladies working there, and he takes good care of them. Just think, Nancy, I'll have money of my own at last. I'll be able to start saving up for a proper home for us." Nancy grinned and turned the mangle to wring out the sodden sheets with renewed vigor. "Maybe I'll be able to work there too. This is just the change in fortunes that we need, Tilly. We'll be free of St. Bartholomew's and be able to get on with living a proper life like other folks." Chapter 2. 5 Points, New York, 1880. Tilly stifled a yawn and pulled the bodice of her gown a little higher. Even though she had been working at the Sailor's Rest Tavern for almost 3 years, she had never gotten used to revealing so much of her skin with a low neckline. By day, she still wore the serviceable gray calico dress for her chores at the orphanage, but in the evening, Norman insisted that his ladies, as he liked to call them, donned the revealing gowns that kept his customers happy. "I don't want to sound ungrateful, Tilly, but the lace on this dress is so itchy it feels like bedbugs, and I can hardly breathe in this corset," Nancy muttered. "Still, at least I'll be earning a few coins each week, like you, now that Matron's got me working here too." Tilly draped a silk shawl over Nancy's shoulders and tied it so that she would look more modest. Nancy was 13 and starting to blossom into her first womanly curves, but Tilly didn't want the lecherous gaze of the drunks in the tavern to rest on her. It wouldn't be right. "Hurry up, you two. There are men parched with thirst out in the bar. I'm not paying you to hide away in the back room." Norman Coldwell barged into the room, where they changed out of their orphanage clothes without knocking. He eyed the shawl on Nancy's shoulders with suspicion. "What's she wearing that for?" he demanded, turning to Tilly. "She caught a chill, and she needs it to keep warm," Tilly replied hastily, saying the first thing that came to mind. She would have to think of a better excuse for the future, but for now, Norman seemed satisfied. "I didn't want to let you down and not come to work, Mr. Coldwell," Nancy said, giving him a sweet smile. "All right, get to work then," he replied. "You can start by washing all the glasses, Nancy, and then fetch some more whiskey bottles from the cellar. I'm expecting a good crowd tonight, as the bad weather has stopped some of the ships from sailing." As Nancy hurried away, Tilly started to follow her, but Norman stepped forward and blocked her way. "You're looking lovelier than ever, Tilly. Have I told you before that you're my favorite?" Tilly felt the blood rush to her cheeks as he trailed his hand down her arm. She liked to keep things businesslike, but lately, Norman had been showering her with attention, much to the annoyance of the 3 other barmaids. "That's kind of you to say so. I'd better go and serve the gentleman, Mr. Coldwell. I don't want to leave it all to the others." Norman ignored her protestations. "There's no need for you to hurry away, Tilly. I just wanted Nancy to start work so we could have a little time together without her." He glanced over his shoulder at the sound of raucous laughter in the bar. "We've known each other for a while now, Tilly, and I've been thinking it might be time for someone to make an honest man of me, if you get what I mean." Tilly thought about the fact that he took Miss Fenton for a cup of tea once a week and smiled. "You mean you and Matron are getting married?" Norman looked at her in astonishment. "Miss Fenton?" He slapped his thigh with amusement and burst out laughing. "No, Tilly. Our arrangement is purely business. She was kind enough to help you and Nancy come and work for me, and I pay her a modest amount each week to thank her. I don't think she earns much at the orphanage, not with that miserly Mr. Walsh in charge. What I'm trying to say is that someone else has captured my attention." Tilly was still puzzled. Mr. Coldwell was almost 40 years old, so he surely didn't mean her. "I'm pleased for you, Mr. Coldwell." She started to edge away. He beamed and nodded. "In that case, make sure none of the other gentlemen lay a hand on you, Tilly, my dear. If you're to become my wife in the future, I don't want any of them pawing you." Tilly's mouth gaped open. "Me?" she gasped. "But Mr. Coldwell, you're so much older. I mean, I assumed you were more drawn to Gladys. She's hinted several times that you and she are very compatible, and she has been working for you for many years." She thought about the oldest barmaid, who was quick to tell them that she was the first person Mr. Coldwell had turned to for comfort when his wife had died 10 years before. Norman's eyes narrowed, and he took a step back, giving her an appraising look. "You're quite right, Tilly. I don't know what came over me." His tone was slightly sullen, and Tilly hoped he hadn't been offended by the way she had been so shocked at his suggestion of marriage. "It's not that I don't ever want to get married, Mr. Coldwell. It's just—" Her words trailed off, and she felt ill-equipped to explain that she had always hoped for a heartwarming romance that would lead to marriage, which didn't seem to be his way. "I'm trying to do my best in the bar," she added hastily, wanting to make amends. She needed this job if she was ever going to make something of herself. "It's all forgotten," Norman replied crisply. "In fact, why don't you let me treat you and Nancy? As it happens, I've instructed the local dressmaker to come and fit you in some new gowns tomorrow. Please make sure you come to work before the other ladies. Miss Fenton knows all about it, so don't worry. She'll be happy to let you leave in good time." "Thank you, Mr. Coldwell. That's very generous of you." Tilly felt troubled by the conversation as she bustled into the bar and started wiping down the sticky tables, and Mr. Coldwell's mercurial mood was difficult to fathom. One moment it felt as though he was hinting that he liked her in a romantic sense, but the next his demeanor was more businesslike, which left her feeling confused. She didn't dare to ask the other barmaids either, as they already complained that she got better treatment than they did. Before she could give it more thought, a group of men barged through the door, already in high spirits from the previous saloons they had visited. There was a thick fog hanging over the city, the first one of fall, and as Mr. Coldwell had predicted, the tavern was soon overrun with sailors keen to make the most of a few more days on land. She poured out tots of whiskey as though they were water, and the rattle of coins on the counter lasted long into the night. As each hour passed, the men drinking there became rowdier and grabbed at the women, some of them even lunging for Nancy. "Try and stay out of their way," Tilly hissed as she jabbed a swaying sailor in the ribs and pulled Nancy free from his grasping hands. "I wouldn't mind taking you upstairs, my pretty." The man turned his attention to Tilly instead, but she managed to push him away. "Get your hands off her," Mr. Coldwell thundered, rushing over to protect her. "Saving her for your other clients, are you?" the man slurred. He gave Tilly a bleary smile. "Next time my ship docks and I've got money to spare, you won't be able to say no to me then, my pretty. Not when I'm paying to be one of Norman's special patrons." "I don't know what you're talking about," Tilly said primly, collecting the empty glasses. "Mr. Coldwell treats all his customers the same and looks after his ladies." As she bustled away, the man behind her burst out laughing in a way that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. What did he mean? A special patron? The strange comment nudged at her mind for the rest of the night, but then she decided it was just drunken ramblings. What was more exciting was the idea of her and Nancy being given new gowns. She always endeavored to work hard for Mr. Coldwell and was grateful that he was treating her and Nancy kindly. Since starting work at the tavern, she had gotten used to the little treats he put her way. Fine velvet gowns, pieces of jewelry, and lately, even a few carriage rides to see the sights of the city after the tavern closed. She couldn't help but feel flattered by the attention, and found herself idly wondering if Mr. Coldwell really did have feelings toward her as a potential wife. She had never thought of him in any romantic way, but now that he had mentioned that he wanted to marry again, the idea took seed in her mind, and she felt a flutter of excitement. Perhaps this would be the way out of St. Bartholomew's for her and Nancy. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Coldwell became even more attentive. First, it was a new velvet gown, each with a matching silk shawl for her and Nancy. Then he insisted on taking them both out to dine, carefully showing them how to eat with the array of silverware that the grand restaurants had, so they wouldn't feel out of place. Tilly had never felt so pampered, and it gave her a glimpse of what life might hold as Mr. Coldwell's wife. Despite the age gap, he behaved with charm and decorum, and Tilly wondered why she had ever had doubts about him. Marriage was never mentioned again, but his hints that it might be just around the corner were hard to miss, especially when he persuaded Matron to allow Tilly and Nancy to take up residence in a comfortable apartment near the tavern instead of having to return to the orphanage each night. "I think they're ready for life beyond St. Bartholomew's, Miss Fenton," Tilly had overheard him saying on the day he came to collect them. "As you wish," Matron had replied, And I have several other young girls who might be suitable to work in the bar when you're ready." Tilly had wondered whether Norman was expanding the business. As far as she was aware, he had all the barmaids he needed, but when she questioned him, he was quick to reassure her. "It's nothing to trouble yourself with, my dear. Now, let's go to the department store so you can pick out some trinkets and hair ribbons. Nothing but the best for you and Nancy, eh?" Now that they had put the orphanage behind them, Tilly slowly started to allow herself to dream of a better future. Marriage to Mr. Coldwell, a safe home for her and Nancy, and above all, the chance of having a family of her own one day if the Lord blessed her and Norman with children. All the loneliness of the past and the harsh, uncaring years in the orphanage would become a distant memory. "Are you in love with Mr. Coldwell?" Nancy asked as she brushed Tilly's hair into ringlets one evening. The first snow of winter was falling outside, and a fire crackled cozily in the hearth. Tilly looked at Nancy in the mirror, giving her question some thought. It was something she had asked herself more than once. "I wouldn't say I'm in love, but I think we will grow to love each other, Nancy. He buys us everything we could want, so perhaps that's his way of showing that he loves me?" Tilly tied a velvet choker around her neck and stood up. Mr. Coldwell had told them to dress in the new gowns he had purchased and to be ready for him to collect them at 6 o'clock sharp, and she wondered where they were going. He had been rather mysterious, and her one regret was that both of their gowns were rather revealing, even though she knew they had been expensive. She would have to tell him she preferred something more modest once they were married, although she didn't want to appear ungrateful. Nancy's question gave her a pang of regret. In her mind, she had always imagined that she would marry after being swept off her feet by someone who had declared that he loved her, but Mr. Coldwell seemed to think such romantic gestures were a waste of time. She sighed and inwardly berated herself for yearning for something which probably didn't even exist other than in fairy tales. "He's here," Nancy darted from the window where she had been keeping watch. "It's the grandest carriage I've ever seen." Mr. Coldwell nodded with approval as he handed them both into the carriage, tweaking Tilly's shawl so that her creamy shoulders were revealed. "That's better. You both look perfect." The drive took them to a part of town Tilly had never seen before, and she wondered if they were going to the theater or if it might be a new restaurant. The plain door and nondescript building gave nothing away, and the doorman studiously looked the other way as Mr. Coldwell ushered them into the entrance hall. "I have a new business partner," he explained as they walked up the stairs. He pushed open the door, and Tilly gasped at the sight that greeted them. The room was opulent in the soft lamplight, with plush velvet drapes, tinkling music from a pianist in the corner, and potted palms. Cigar smoke hung in the air, and there were card tables all along one side of the room where gambling games were already underway. At first glance, Tilly didn't recognize anyone, but gradually she realized that some of the older gentlemen were people who occasionally came to the tavern. But here, they looked different. Well-dressed and clearly very wealthy. Something didn't feel quite right, and it took her a moment to put her finger on what it was. But when she saw it, she felt a shiver of unease. All of the men were old, 40 or 50 years, some even more. Yet the women who were serving drinks and fluttering attentively around them were the same age as her. It seemed strange that none of the wives were the same age as their husbands. She turned to Mr. Coldwell with the question on her lips, but then the words died as her stomach lurched with a sickening realization. The women in this luxurious room weren't wives, none of them. They were ladies of the night. "You and Nancy are to entertain my guests," Norman told them both flatly. He gestured to a woman in the corner. "Gloriana, my business partner, will show you what to do, and there will be a carriage waiting outside for you in the morning." "But Mr. Coldwell, Norman, we didn't agree to this." Tilly's words came out in an anguished whisper as she saw the look of fear in Nancy's eyes. Suddenly she understood everything. The expensive gifts, the way Matron had happily agreed to supply more girls for working at the tavern and accepted money from him each week, and the reason why marriage was never mentioned again after her first refusal. "You owe me, Tilly," Mr. Coldwell said smoothly. Without my patronage, you'd both still be stuck in that miserable orphanage, wearing rags and working in the laundry. Don't let me down." With a curt nod, he turned on his heel and hurried away. "Well, aren't you both pretty?" Gloriana said, as she sashayed toward them. "Norman told me he would supply only the best. The gentlemen are going to be fighting over you. I can already tell. Let me show you to the boudoirs so you can see where you'll be later, and then you can serve drinks for a while and get to know the customers." "Tilly, do we have to?" Nancy clung to Tilly's side, trembling as several of the men turned to stare at them. Tilly felt crushing disappointment coursing through her veins. Working for Mr. Coldwell had never been about escaping the orphanage. She had foolishly thought that he and Miss Fenton wanted the best for them, but the gut-wrenching truth was that she and Nancy were just pawns in their ambitions to make money out of them. All the dreams she had allowed herself to harbor over recent weeks had turned to dust in the blink of an eye. "No, Nancy, we don't," Tilly said firmly. "I don't care what the consequences are. I'm not going to allow them to put us through this." Tilly gripped Nancy's hand, and they ran, down the stairs, past the doorman, who tried to block their way, and out into the cold night. They ran until they could run no more. The breath seared like hot daggers in their chests, until finally, Tilly staggered to a halt. "We're never going back there, Nancy," she cried. "Not to the orphanage or to the tavern. We're on our own now, but I promise I'll always look after you." Chapter 3. 5 Points, New York, 1880. Brody Kinton pulled a handful of coins from his pocket and did a quick mental calculation. He had enough for a hot drink and some food, but not a lot more. As he strode through the back streets of 5 Points, he seemed remarkably unworried by his perilous financial state. To the casual observer, Brody looked happy with his lot in life. His dark hair and rugged complexion set him apart from the pale, short-sighted clerks who shuffled past him, and the way he whistled under his breath and nodded politely to the other folks around made them turn and stare, wondering why he was being so friendly. He spotted an old man with a brazier and coffee stand on the street corner across the way and waited patiently for the wagons to rumble past before sauntering toward it. "1 cup of your finest coffee and a scoop of roast chestnuts, please." The old man gave him an appraising look. "You're not from around here, then? I've been watching you saying good morning to everyone. Most folks don't behave like that around these parts. Prefer to keep to themselves." He poured the dark brew into a tin mug and scooped some chestnuts into a twist of paper. Brody shrugged and took a sip of the coffee. It tasted good and strong, just how he liked it. "It doesn't cost anything to be friendly, does it? But you're right. I'm more used to small-town living, where everyone knows everyone, and it would be rude not to speak to passers-by." He glanced around, grimacing slightly at how busy the streets were. It was a far cry from the wide-open spaces he preferred, and he couldn't wait to be on his way again. New York was not for him, but he had business to attend to. "Do you happen to know where the offices of Ennis Layton are?" he asked the old man. "The lawyer, you mean?" The old man pulled a face, revealing his dislike of such men. "Keep going down Broad Street until you start to see the buildings that look better kept than around here, and you'll see it, opposite the bank, with a shiny brass plaque on the door." He looked Brody up and down. "You don't look like his typical sort of client, if you don't mind me saying. I've never met the man before, but I have a letter from him." Brody grinned and looked down at his dusty leather boots. "I don't suppose he deals with many cowboys, but apparently he needs to see me. What can I say?" "Coffee, miss?" The old man had lost interest in his story and was already looking for his next customer. Brody followed his gaze and saw 2 young ladies hovering near the newspaper stand just along the sidewalk. They were both wearing velvet gowns with silk shawls over their shoulders, which made them look incongruous amongst the other people on the street, who were all wearing dark coats to stave off the cold. They reminded him of exotic birds, and he wondered why they weren't wearing something warmer, too. Their conversation drifted toward him, and he idly listened as he sipped his coffee. "Look, the matrimonial times, Tilly. Why don't you reply to one of the advertisements in there? I heard Gladys saying that's what she was going to do if she couldn't find a respectable husband around here. Just because things didn't work out with, well, don't give up on love altogether. You always said you wanted to marry and have children. Maybe what happened was a sign you need a fresh start. Brody edged a little closer to them, his interest piqued. He noticed that although the velvet gowns looked expensive, they were grubby, and the women looked tired and hungry, as though they were down on their luck. He could see now that one of them was still only a girl, and the fair-haired woman, called Tilly, looked to be about 20 years old. The newspaper vendor came around to the front of his cart, sensing the opportunity to make a sale. "A beauty like you would get a husband in no time," he said, picking up a copy of the newspaper to hand it to her. "There's no shame in it, my dear. All you have to do is reply to some of the advertisements and write to the gentleman you like the sound of. You could be married by summer, with a nice house of your own in a frontier town. It's better than scraping by here in 5 Points." He grinned encouragingly at the younger girl. "You've got the right idea, miss. You should persuade your friend to have a go. Lots of young ladies from this part of town travel west looking for love." The woman hesitated and then pulled the younger girl away slightly. She lowered her voice. "I don't know. Romance is the last thing on my mind at the moment. But I do know that we can't spend another week sleeping under the arches, Nancy. It's not safe. I think we'll have to sell these dresses and get second-hand ones instead. Maybe they will raise enough money to rent a room for a few nights while I look for work. I only have the few coins I had in my reticule left. I was hoping that if I could keep this dress, I'd find a better job, but it's attracting the wrong sort of attention." She pulled her shawl tighter and shivered. "You could travel west with a marriage bureau anyway," the newspaper vendor suggested helpfully, trying to get their attention again. "My wife's cousin didn't have a husband lined up, but still went to Montana, hoping for a better life. Plenty of jobs out there. And she was married within a year." He waved the newspaper at them. "I'll even let you have this half price. It's last week's copy, and I need to shift it." Nancy seemed torn between wanting to get the newspaper and glancing longingly at the chestnuts and coffee on the old man's stall. The way her hands rested over her stomach, as if to contain her hunger, made Brody come to a decision. "Give me 2 more mugs of coffee, please," he said to the old man. He slapped another coin down to cover the cost. "You look like you could use a hot drink," he called to Nancy. "Have these on me." He jerked his head toward the old man who was holding the mugs out for them. Nancy hurried over, shooting him a grateful smile. "Thank you, sir, that's very kind." "Wait a minute, Nancy." Tilly gave Brody a hard stare. "What do you want in return?" she asked suspiciously. "Nothing, ma'am," Brody shrugged. "I couldn't help but overhear that you're short of money. I figured you'd like a cup of coffee, that's all." Tilly nodded, and Nancy wrapped her hands around the tin mug and took a long sip of her drink, closing her eyes as she savored it. "So you're thinking of traveling out west, are you?" Brody said, eager to make conversation and show that his gesture was just out of politeness. "It's nice if you pick the right place, and as the man said, there's plenty of work to be had." A guarded expression came over Tilly's face. "We're looking into our options." Brody offered them both a roast chestnut before standing back slightly. The way Tilly's green eyes constantly darted back and forth, looking at the people in the streets, made him wonder if she was avoiding someone, and he felt an unexpected surge of empathy for her. He knew what it felt like to be looking over your shoulder, expecting the worst. The church clock chimed the hour, and Brody suddenly realized he would be late for his appointment if he didn't leave. He raised his wide-brimmed Stetson hat and gave them a nod. "Good luck to you both. I'm sorry I can't offer you more help, but hopefully the coffee will keep the chill away for a little while. Nice to meet you." Tilly relaxed as she realized that his intentions were honorable and smiled up at him. His heart skipped a beat at the transformation. Her green eyes were luminous, and in the brief moment her worries were put aside, he could see that she was a beautiful woman. "Thank you again. We appreciate your kindness." As Brody hurried down Broad Street, his thoughts turned to his fiancée, Anna. Former fiancée, he reminded himself. He had managed to go several hours without thinking of her, but something about his encounter with Tilly had brought her to mind again. Perhaps it was the simple act of enjoying a young woman's company, even for just a few minutes, in this crowded city where he felt like he knew nobody. "I'm sorry I can't be the person you want me to be." His parting words to Anna were branded on his mind, and an image of her flouncing out of his life with a backward look of scorn over her shoulder made him sigh. He had been so sure she was the one for him. After drifting from job to job, he had finally found a place to settle down in Ohio. Working as a ranch hand brought him a steady income, and Anna Hickling had captured his heart. They had been courting for almost a year, but Anna wanted more. Where he saw beauty in the wide-open plains, she complained that the place was dull and that nothing ever happened. Where Brody dreamt of showing his future children how to work the land and enjoy the company of friends in a close-knit community, Anna yearned for the latest fashions and bright lights of city life. He pulled the lawyer's letter from his pocket with a rueful look. When he had been summoned to Mr. Layton's office in New York, Anna had jumped at the chance to accompany him. "How about we get married while we're there, Brody?" she'd said. "And you could look for work. It would be perfect." His boss was so annoyed at losing him that he told Brody never to come back, and he had used all his meager savings for them to travel east, only for Anna to declare that she had no intention of settling down with him. She was going to become a chorus line singer and fulfill her dreams of marrying a high society gentleman who understood her better than Brody ever would. That had been 3 days ago, and upon reflection, Brody had to admit that perhaps their differences were too great to overcome, and Anna was not the right woman for him. If it hadn't been for needing to wait for his meeting with Mr. Layton, he would have taken the first steam train out of New York. But now he found himself on the steps of the lawyer's offices, nursing a bruised heart, with no plan for his future other than hoping to earn his fare back west somehow, and a vague hope that he would find work as a ranch hand somewhere, even if he wasn't sure where that would be quite yet. "You're a hard man to track down, Mr. Kinton." Ennis Layton added a generous splash of rum to his coffee and took a noisy slurp. His tone was resentful, as though Brody had conspired to make his job harder on purpose. "I've moved around a bit for work, that's true," Brody replied mildly. He glanced around the imposing office. The wood-paneled walls were dotted with gilt-framed oil paintings of naval battle scenes and officious-looking certificates. He dreaded to think what the lawyer's fees would be if he expected to be paid for his services. "What do you need to see me about? Your letter didn't give much away." "My client is very discreet, that's why." Mr. Layton took another slurp of coffee and rifled through the teetering pile of documents on his desk. "Aha! Here it is." He pulled a single sheet of paper out and read it slowly, pausing only to pour another tot of rum into his coffee. The clock ticked in the corner, and Brody coughed discreetly to remind Mr. Layton that he was still waiting for an answer. He wondered how much rum the man had already consumed that day, rather a large amount, judging by his florid complexion. "Do you need to see the letter you sent me?" Brody pulled it out of his pocket again. "No, just reminding myself of Mrs. Clay's instructions." He read for a moment longer before lowering the piece of paper and smiling at Brody. "It's all come back to me now." "Okay, and what are the instructions?" Brody could see that he would need to keep the man focused if he was going to find out the reason for the meeting. Mr. Layton leaned forward in a sudden show of clarity and efficiency. "My client is Mrs. Verity Clay. She has instructed me to look for her only living relative, her nephew, Brody Kinton. That would be you," he added, chuckling at his own joke. Brody hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "That's me, yes. What does Mrs. Clay want with me?" Mr. Layton was momentarily distracted by a fat pigeon that had landed on the windowsill, and Brody coughed again. "Well, I'd have thought that was obvious. As I said, you are her only living relative. She doesn't have long to live, and she wants to get to know you, as you will be the sole heir to her ranch in Wyoming. She remembers you as a young boy, but that was many years ago. She doesn't want to leave the place to someone who wouldn't care for it, you see." It's her life's work, and the prospect of her mortality has made her want to get her affairs in order while there's still time. I can understand that, Brody agreed. So she would like me to travel out west, huh? Mr. Layton nodded. I got the impression she was disappointed that you hadn't thought of it yourself, but I gather there was a rift in the family in the past. Yes, I guess work kept me busy, but it's never too late to make amends. Do you have the address of her ranch? Brody asked. My parents never really spoke of her after the rift. The lawyer slid the document across the desk. It's just outside a place called Rocky River in Wyoming. Sounds like it's the back of beyond, but some folks like that sort of thing. He shuddered slightly, glad of his comfortable life in New York. Did she say how soon she wants to see me? Brody wondered how long it would take him to scrape together his fare to travel to Wyoming. It sounded like he would need to hurry. Well, as soon as possible, of course. Mr. Layton stood up and leaned his hands on his desk for a moment to get his balance before opening a drawer in the cabinet behind him. He withdrew a pouch of coins and handed them to Brody. Here you are. Money for your travel costs, and a bit extra. She's a generous woman, your aunt. Brody's eyebrows shot up as he felt the weight of it and slipped it into his pocket. Very generous indeed, he said, smiling. I'll be on my way then, Mr. Layton. Thank you for being persistent in tracking me down in Ohio. Well, it's to pay for both of you, of course. Your aunt was very particular about making sure your wife would have a comfortable journey out west, Mr. Kenton. My wife? Brody felt the blood draining from his face. I don't have a wife. I'm afraid Anna decided that she would rather live in New York. It didn't work out between us. Mr. Layton frowned, clearly annoyed that Brody had done yet another thing to make his job more difficult. My inquiries led me to believe you were all but married, and now you're telling me she's no longer with you? Anna wouldn't have liked living in Wyoming, Mr. Layton, so it's probably for the best. No. It's not for the best, the lawyer snapped. I promised your aunt you were married. She wants a family to inherit the ranch and live there for many years, not a bachelor who might sell up on a whim after her death. He shook his head and sighed heavily. His pleasant demeanor was rapidly turning into something more unfriendly. Unless you're married, I won't be paid my fee for this job. I suggest you get yourself a wife as quickly as you can, Mr. Kenton. Your inheritance will be gifted to the Rocky River community otherwise, and I'm sure you don't want that to happen. I guess I could go and speak with Anna if I can find her. Brody sounded doubtful. He knew exactly what her answer would be. Suddenly, a sly look came over Mr. Layton's face. Who says it has to be her? Anyone would do. You just need to find a nice young woman who's looking for a fresh start in life and give your aunt proof that you're married. Brody's mouth gaped open. He had never heard anything so ridiculous in his life, and he pulled the money back out of his pocket to hand it back. I can't do that. My heart was set on Anna, and even if I think maybe we weren't best suited, after all, I can't just summon a new fiancé out of thin air. Don't be a fool, the lawyer growled. He gestured to the grand office and thrust his face closer to Brody's with a menacing air. I need her fee to keep this place going. Look at it this way. Mrs. Clay doesn't have long to live, and if seeing you happily married makes her last few weeks or months on this earth happier, what's the harm in a little deception, huh? Most women would jump at the chance of being a rancher's wife. I'm sure you can find someone to fill that role if you put your mind to it. He shoved the money back into Brody's hands and opened the office door to show him out. And if I don't manage it, Brody muttered, you will. Once you think about what you could lose, the lawyer said. He gripped Brody's arm tightly and squeezed. He was surprisingly strong for a man who spent all day behind his desk. As I said, I need the fee. I have acquaintances in many states out west, which is how I managed to track you down. I'm sure I could find you again if I wanted to, Mr. Kenton. So how about you do the right thing for your aunt and for me? Brody nodded and pulled his arm away. You'll get your fee one way or another, he replied curtly. As he hurried back out onto the street, the enormity of what had just happened started to sink in. He had a life-changing opportunity dangling in front of him, like a juicy carrot in front of a hungry mule, but no wife to meet Mrs. Clay's exacting requirements. He needed to think fast if he was going to make his dream come true. Chapter 4. 5 Points, New York, 1880. Did you see where those 2 young ladies went? Brody tried to keep the urgency from his voice as he made sure the old man at the coffee stall saw the gleaming coin in his hand. I'll take 2 twists of roast chestnuts to make it worth your while. They both looked hungry. The old man gave him a shrewd look from under his bushy eyebrows. Old Leighton must have had good news for you then. Brody shrugged and nodded. Yes, in a manner of speaking. Well, I'm a good judge of character, and you seem like a decent sort of man. He paused, weighing up whether or not Brody was trustworthy. Reckon you'll find them under the railway arches on the way to the docks. Poor things. He sucked on his teeth and shook his head. I don't think they've had much luck in life, so mind you, don't do anything to make it worse, son. They don't deserve that. Brody gave the old man slightly more money than was needed as thanks and tipped his hat. I might be many things, but I ain't dishonorable to young ladies, he called as he hurried away. In the time he had been at the lawyer's office, a cold wind had picked up, and it cut through Brody's coat, making him shiver. He was used to hard winters on the ranch, but there was something grimly depressing about the filthy slush that sprayed up from the wheels of the wagons as they rumbled past, and the gaunt children, clad in rags, who darted barefoot through the people out shopping, begging for coins. A pall of smoke from the warehouses and factories hung over 5 Points, making his eyes feel gritty, and he had a sudden longing for the rolling hills and crisp air of the ranch he had left behind. After 10 minutes of walking, during which Brody was careful to keep a lookout for pickpockets, he spied the arches looming darkly ahead of him. The night was already starting to draw in, and several fires flickered on the cobbles that people were huddled around, trying to keep warm. He saw rats picking their way through mounds of rotting trash out of the corner of his eye, and bedraggled women swigging gin as their children sat hollow-eyed next to them. Suddenly, a fight broke out between 2 men, and Brody hastily sidestepped out of their way. The last thing he wanted was to get embroiled in a brawl. Brody's eyes gradually adjusted to the gloom, but a quick look told him that Tilly and Nancy were not there. He would have spotted their bright dresses, but all he could see was a horde of people in dirty gray clothes. He sighed and turned on his heel. There was no point staying, and he had a feeling this part of town would only get more dangerous as the night progressed. "Where are you?" he muttered to himself. More than anything, he found himself worrying that they were living somewhere so awful. It was no place for 2 young ladies to be sleeping. Even though he had only spent a few minutes in their company, he could tell that they had been born to something better, but were down on their luck. Even the hardiest of folks wouldn't survive long in this sort of environment, and every shadow seemed to hold menace and threat. "You looking for trouble?" One of the men who had been fighting came staggering toward him. He already had a purple bruise blooming under one eye, and his fists were still clenched. "Give me your coat," he growled. Brody backed away and quickened his pace. As he rounded the corner and came out of the shelter of the arches, the wind whipped into his face, and he was momentarily blinded by the falling snow. The next thing he knew, someone had crashed headlong into him and sprawled onto the ground at his feet. "Look where you're going." The voice was familiar, and Brody found himself looking down at Tilly. Nancy was standing nearby, glaring at him. "I'm sorry I didn't see you." Brody quickly helped Tilly up, and she brushed the snow off her gown. He gave them both an apologetic grin and held out the chestnuts. "I came looking for you to give you some food. It's not much." I said, "Give me your coat." The drunken man suddenly lumbered around the corner after him, and Nancy shrieked with fear. He eyed Tilly and licked his lips. "I've seen you under the arches these last few nights. A pretty woman like you is just what I need to keep me warm at night." He lunged at Tilly, and she stepped to one side, just managing to dodge out of the way of his grasping hands. "Are you stealing the woman I want?" the man bellowed, turning on Brody again. "Come on, we need to get out of here," Brody said hastily. Without waiting for an answer, he bundled Tilly and Nancy ahead of him. "It's not safe for you to spend another night here with men like him around." As soon as they were back in the market square, where the gas lamps were being lit and shoppers bustled in and out of the stores, Tilly stopped and linked arms with Nancy. "Thank you for helping us," she said breathlessly. "It was very kind of you, but why have you been following us?" Brody grinned sheepishly. "You caught my eye earlier when I was at the coffee stall." He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair before extending his hand to shake hers. "Let me start again. I'm Brody Kinton. Nice to make your acquaintance. I'm not from around here, as you can probably tell." Tilly hesitated for a moment, then shook his hand. There was something about his warm brown eyes and the awkwardness of his introduction that made her smile in spite of being on her guard. "I'm Tilly Harvey, and this is Nancy. We're not exactly sisters, but we sort of are," Nancy piped up, giving him a curious look. "I'm very glad I found you." Brody continued, still looking awkward. "The Arches? Have you been there long?" He made it sound like he was making polite conversation about a charming cottage, and Tilly couldn't help but chuckle. "Too long," she said lightly, not wanting to reveal how truly awful their situation was. "It's just temporary until I can find work and rent a room for us." A rowdy clamor from a group of men outside the nearest saloon made her feel uneasy, and she glanced around the market square. Norman's parting words were still ringing in her ears that Tilly owed him. She wondered what lengths he would go to try and find her and Nancy and draw them back into his world and force her to become a woman of ill repute. Brody twisted his hat in his hands and then put it on again. Tilly felt a flutter of intrigue in her chest as she looked at him, but then quickly pushed the feeling aside. He might have the broad chest of a man used to physical labor and a slightly lopsided smile that made his eyes crinkle when he spoke to her, but she couldn't afford to feel attracted to a man she had only just met. Especially not when she had gotten Norman Coldwell so wrong. "I know we only just met," Brody started. Tilly flushed, wondering if he had somehow read her mind. "The thing is, I just came into a bit of money, and I'm worried about you both being out on the streets and homeless. Would you let me treat you to a proper hot meal? I passed a restaurant over yonder that looks pretty decent." He waited for Tilly's slow nod before continuing. "I've got a proposition I'd like to put to you." Tilly recoiled. "Certainly not." She took hold of Nancy's arm protectively. "We might be down on our luck, but I'm not that sort of woman." She felt a wave of disappointment engulf her. Just when she was starting to think Brody might be a kind-hearted man, he had proven himself to be no better than Norman. "Oh no, I didn't mean what you're thinking," Brody said, looking alarmed that she had misunderstood his intentions so badly. "If anyone so much as looks at you or Nancy with that in mind, they would have me to deal with first. I'd never want to see a woman treated in that way. I think our business is done here." Tilly replied with a tinge of regret. It had been a relief to feel as though someone was looking out for their safety for the last few minutes, but now she wasn't so sure they should remain in his company. "I'm explaining this very badly," Brody said, giving her a rueful smile. "Will you let me try again? Fancy words are not my strong point, you see. I'm more used to working with horses and cattle. The thing is, I've got a problem, I guess you could call it. It's something you might be able to help me with, and in return, I think I can help you and Nancy get away from here to somewhere better." "Maybe it was fate bumping into him," Nancy whispered behind her hand. "Can we at least have the food and listen to what he has to say, Tilly? I'm so hungry." Nancy's plea reminded Tilly that she had spent the last of her money earlier that day on a couple of bruised apples and the old copy of the Matrimonial Times. At the time, writing to a kind-hearted man in a quest to marry had seemed like a good idea, but now she wished she had saved her money. Her feet were aching from walking for hours, and in spite of knocking on dozens of doors to look for work as a maid in the smarter end of town, as soon as the housekeepers realized that Nancy needed a roof over her head as well, they had slammed the door closed in their faces. Hunger gnawed at her belly and made her come to a decision. "A hot meal each for Nancy and me, and your solemn word that you won't try anything untoward, Mr. Kinton. If you can agree to that, I'll listen to this problem of yours and see if I can help." Tilly tilted her chin upward and gave him a defiant look. Even though she was desperate for something to eat, she wanted to do it on her terms. Thankfully, Brody's face broke into a wide smile. "You have my word, Miss Harvey. Let's get into the warm and have some food, shall we?" He gave her a courteous bow, and Nancy clapped her hands with excitement. "Come on, Tilly, I'm starving." She scampered ahead, and Brody offered Tilly the crook of his arm to hang on to as they followed her across the cobbles, which were slippery with snow. "You want me to be your wife?" Tilly's exclamation came out louder than she had intended, and several of the other diners turned to stare, giving her a fond smile. "I don't know what to say." Tilly put her knife and fork down. Her appetite suddenly lost. Brody had ordered ham pie and mashed potatoes for all of them, accompanied by 3 steaming cups of tea, and Nancy had fallen upon her plate of food, too busy for conversation as she devoured the tasty fare. As Tilly ate more slowly, savoring each mouthful, Brody explained his situation. "I have to be honest with you, Tilly. Until last week, I thought I would be marrying Anna, but she had other ideas. I won't insult you by pretending that this is anything other than a business arrangement." He paused and tore off a piece of bread to mop up the gravy. "I was all for telling Mr. Layton that the idea was ludicrous, but then he pointed out that if it made a dying woman happy, then who was I to deny her that final peace of mind? And you say that she's your aunt, but you haven't seen her for years." Tilly couldn't understand why Brody would be so distant from his relations when having a family was all she had yearned for at the orphanage. An expression flitted across Brody's face that Tilly found hard to read. Was it shame? Embarrassment? Perhaps he regretted not making the effort until his aunt was dying. "Yes," he said hesitantly. "I've moved around with work a lot, and I always figured I would get around to visiting her, but the time never seemed right." Tilly sighed, feeling troubled. "I don't like the idea of deceiving her. If your Aunt Verity wants to leave her ranch to a family, do you really think it's right to pretend we're man and wife?" Brody had the grace to look guilty. "Mr. Layton explained that the reason Aunt Verity wanted me to be married was that she was worried I might sell the ranch off after her death. But the truth is, I would never do that. It's always been my dream to have a ranch of my own, ever since." "Well, I won't bore you with my past," he muttered. Tilly watched him closely as he spoke, wondering whether she could trust her judgment. Her instinct was that Brody was kind-hearted. He wanted to please his aunt. But maybe it's just to get the inheritance, and he doesn't care for her at all. Her rational mind tried to give her all the objections. "I give you my word that I won't sell the ranch, and I will continue to work it as the legacy she wants it to be," Brody said earnestly. "When the time comes, you and Nancy can stay if you wish. Maybe as a housekeeper, or I'll put every dollar I earn toward paying you enough to help you start over out west. Whichever you choose. I don't know exactly how long it will take, but I promise I'll do the right thing by you and Nancy." Tilly glanced outside. It was dark, and she could see drunken men stumbling out of the saloon across the street. One of them reminded her of Norman, and she shuddered, her mind racing with worry. What choice do I have? Stay here in 5 Points, always looking over my shoulder in case Norman finds us? Hope that I find work before we come to harm out on the streets? "Why did you choose me?" she asked quietly. "Is it because we're orphans, with no family to miss us?" "No, I didn't even know that," Brody began, gulping down another mouthful of tea. He looked bashful again. "My head has been in a muddle since Anna left me, to be honest. I thought I knew how to make her happy, but it turns out she preferred city life. But there's something about you that makes me feel hopeful for the future again. You're resourceful and say what you mean, and the way you look after Nancy is something I admire. I'd like to help you out, that's all." Tilly felt her cheeks turning pink. Nobody had ever described her character in such flattering terms. She was only used to comments about her appearance, as though that was all that mattered, and she felt herself wavering. Perhaps Brody saw more in her than Norman ever had. Maybe it was fate seeing you at the newspaper stand earlier when you were talking about heading to the frontier to get married? I don't know. Brody scratched his chin and gave her a beguiling smile. "I guess I just figured we could both help each other. I can pay for you to travel west to Rocky River, and maybe help you find work after Aunt Verity passes. It's a way for you and Nancy to have a fresh start, away from whatever is troubling you here." Tilly lowered her eyes. So he noticed. He knows I'm running from somebody. She thought about the gnawing worry which had filled every waking moment since she had left Norman, and how foolish she felt for thinking that he had loved her. Instead of the happy future she had imagined when Norman had showered her with gifts and attention, she had found herself penniless and destined to be used by men, but never adored as a wife. But here was Brody Kinton, proposing marriage and offering financial security for her and Nancy. A way out of her urgent dilemma, even if it was only for a short while. She looked up again and met his gaze. His brown eyes looked concerned, but hopeful. And if she wasn't mistaken, there was a shade of affection there too, which made her heart flutter. "All right," she said firmly. "I'll be your wife, and we'll accompany you to Rocky River, but only on one condition. Go ahead. What is it?" "You must promise that there won't be any secrets between us. I have to be able to trust you if this is to work, Mr. Kinton. We will be married for convenience, but I don't want to deceive your aunt in any other way. And you must promise to look after the ranch after she's gone, if that is her wish." Brody nodded happily and waved for the waitress to fetch more cups of tea for them. "Sounds like we have a deal, Miss Harvey. And please, call me Brody. If we're to be husband and wife, we'd better start sounding the part." Chapter 5. 5 Points, New York, October 1880. "Do you have any belongings?" Brody had been too polite to ask outright how Tilly and Nancy had ended up sleeping under the arches with only the clothes on their backs. Tilly shivered outside the tea room and tightened her shawl. "Nothing that I dare risk going back for." She glanced at Nancy with a questioning look. "You may as well tell him," Nancy said. "It wasn't our fault we ended up running away." As Tilly briefly explained what Norman had expected of her and Nancy and how angry he probably was that they had disobeyed him, Brody's face darkened with anger. How could he treat you like that? And with Nancy just 13 years old as well. What sort of man would do such a thing? "That's why we're dressed like this," Tilly said, gesturing to their revealing velvet gowns. "We daren't go back to the rooms where we used to live. It's too close to the tavern, and Norman knows almost everybody in that part of town." Brody patted his pocket with a thoughtful look. "Mr. Layton gave me enough money for 2 rail fares out west in one of the good carriages. I reckon if you don't mind having a cheaper seat, we'll have enough to rent a room for a couple of nights and get some different gowns for you. What do you say?" "And what about the cost of getting married?" "I've been thinking about it some more," Brody replied. "It sounds like you had a lucky escape from Mr. Coldwell, and I can understand it might take you a little while to put your trust in someone else so soon. Why don't we get married when we get to Rocky River instead? That way you'll know my intentions toward you are honorable." Tilly looked at him in confusion. Is he trying to deceive me? Changing the plan already? The more she thought about it, though, she realized that he was trying to be fair to her instead. He was taking a leap of faith by paying for her fare to go west. She could leave him as soon as they arrived if she was the sort of person to go back on her word, without ever going to his aunt's ranch. It seemed that by giving her the choice, he was trying to help restore her faith in humanity. Norman Coldwell had pretended to love her and show her kindness to manipulate her into doing something dreadful. He had wanted her to feel trapped and indebted to him, so he could bend her to his will. But Brody Kinton was different. He was showing Tilly that she had a way out if she wanted. He wasn't going to force her to do something she didn't want to. It was the complete opposite of how Norman had behaved, and Tilly felt a wave of relief. She smiled up at him as a fragile bond of trust started to take root in her heart. "A room sounds good if you can afford it, but you'll have to sleep in the chair. Nancy and I would be very grateful to share the bed for the night if you don't mind. We've only been able to snatch a few minutes at a time under the arches." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Brody replied with a grin. "After countless long nights waiting for cows to calve and guarding the livestock against wolves, I can practically sleep standing up." They headed toward the railroad station to find a cheap room for the night. and Nancy's excited chatter about the journey ahead helped distract Tilly's thoughts that, under different circumstances, Brody was exactly the sort of gentleman she could very easily fall in love with. The railroad journey west was long and tiring, but for Tilly and Nancy, it barely mattered. Compared to the fear of constantly hiding from Norman and the danger of sleeping on the streets, even the cheapest carriage on the train felt like a luxury. The garrulous chatter of the other occupants entertained them, and Brody became a firm favorite with all the ladies traveling west as mail-order brides. Nothing was too much trouble as he courteously helped lift bags and offered his arm to steady them as they clambered on and off the train when they stopped for refreshments and to drop people off along the way. "He's good with the little ones, dear. He'll make a wonderful father himself when you have a family." One of the other ladies in the carriage gave Brody a fond smile as he walked her two young children up the carriage to look out of the window so that she could have a break. She leaned in a bit closer to Tilly. "How come you're traveling west together? Most of us are meeting our husbands-to-be when we get there." She had noticed that although Tilly had told her they were to be wed as soon as they arrived, there was a certain awkwardness between them on the train. "We're only just getting to know each other," Tilly confided. "I was going to reply to an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times like you did, but as it happened, Mr. Kinton was on business in New York, and he proposed there and then." "How delightful, dear. A whirlwind romance." The woman looked envious and a little sad. "My fiancé lost his first wife to cholera and has a little girl, and I was widowed last year. It's a second marriage for both of us, but I'm hoping that we'll all get along. I'm sure you and Mr. Kinton will soon feel more settled together once you're busy in your new life. He's such a kind, thoughtful gentleman." Tilly couldn't help but feel moved by all the stories of the women traveling on the train, hoping for a better future for themselves and their families. The woman was right about Brody. Seeing how he treated the other travelers had helped ease her fears that she was throwing in her lot with someone she didn't know. The trouble was that in those moments when a real man and wife would have been at ease with each other, she still felt awkward, and she could tell that he did too. When he helped her on and off the train, the unfamiliar feel of his hand on her waist set her heart aflutter in a way that surprised her, yet also reminded her of the grasping men she had seen in Norman's tavern, making her want to pull away. It's not for long. As soon as Brody secures his inheritance, we won't have to pretend to be man and wife again. The thought that flickered through Tilly's mind almost every hour popped up again, but this time she wasn't sure whether she found it reassuring or disappointing. "We're nearly at Hudsonville." Nancy bustled back to her seat and sat down next to her, fizzing with excitement. "Do you think I'll be able to find work in Rocky River as well, Tilly? I don't want to be a burden to you and Brody." Tilly patted her hand. "Don't ever think that, silly. I promised that I would take care of you, and I will. We're doing this together, remember? A better life for both of us. From what folks on the train have said, Rocky River is thriving. There are new men arriving to work at the mines and ranches all the time, so I'm sure you'll be able to get a job at one of the stores, or perhaps in a boarding house. We'll figure it out when we get there." Brody came and sat down with them again. "I expect we'll be busy enough on Mrs. Clay's ranch to start with. If it's a little way out of town, it might not be possible to work in a store." "Do you know how far out of the town the ranch is?" Nancy asked as she gathered up the few belongings they had purchased before the journey. "I can't recall exactly where it is," Brody said, sounding vague. "My parents never talked about her much after the family rift," he added quietly. He pointed out of the window as the first glimpse of Hudsonville came into view through the billowing steam from the train's engine. "Almost there, look." Tilly gave him a sympathetic smile. He didn't seem to want to talk about his aunt very much, and she could only assume that it was because it brought back uncomfortable memories. She wanted to ask what the family had fallen out about, but thought that perhaps it would be better to wait until they were off the train so people wouldn't overhear. "At least you'll have a chance to put things right with your Aunt Verity before it's too late," she whispered. Too many families take their disagreements to the grave, which I always think is a terrible shame. I'd give anything to discover I had some long-lost family members. It really is a blessing that Mr. Layton tracked you down." Brody nodded, but his brown eyes looked troubled. "You're a better person than me, Tilly. Knowing that you've lost all your family makes me realize that I've behaved selfishly in the past." "It's never too late to change," Tilly replied, holding his gaze for a moment. "It's just a pity that I won't be with him to see the man he becomes in the future." She felt another wave of confusion about her feelings toward him. Before she had a chance to say more, the screech of brakes from the train interrupted the moment, and Nancy jumped up. "We're here! Now we only have the stagecoach journey to do, and we'll be at our new home in no time." Even though it was late October and summer was long gone, Hudsonville seemed like paradise to Tilly. The snow lay thickly on the ground as they trudged along the main street, still sparkling white from where it had only just fallen that morning, and the air was crisp and clean. Although the stores looked quaint compared to what she was used to seeing in New York, it seemed like there was everything you could need. She wondered whether this might end up being her new home after leaving the ranch. There were plenty of boarding houses and hotels, and she had already seen several maids scurrying past them to buy supplies who looked about Nancy's age. They would be able to find work easily enough, which was a reassuring thought. They wouldn't have to return to New York, and Norman would never know they had come to Wyoming. "Didn't the porter at the station say that we would see the stagecoach outside the mercantile store?" Tilly felt a ripple of alarm as she looked up and down the street. There were plenty of wagons rumbling past, but nothing that looked like what she was expecting for the next part of their journey. Brody hurried ahead. He wasn't sure whether Mr. Layton had told his aunt what date they were arriving, but if she was gravely ill, time was not on their side. "I'll ask in the store. I'm sure they'll know." A moment later, he returned with a worried frown. "Apparently, the stagecoach was held up by bandits yesterday, and the driver is out of action. The owner of the mercantile told me it might be a few days before the next one for Rocky River is heading out." What should we do? Tilly was reminded again that she had no money of her own and had to rely on Brody for their security. "Can you ride a horse?" he asked with a sudden grin. "A horse?" Nancy spluttered. "I've never been on one in my life." "Me neither," Tilly chimed in. "But we're quick learners." She was determined not to be the sort of woman who was terrified of trying new things, especially if it was something that would help them fit in better in their new life out west. "In that case, you're about to get your first taste of being proper frontier women," Brody said with a chuckle. He gave Tilly a couple of coins. "Why don't you go and have a hot meal in the tea room over there? I'll be back in an hour with horses and supplies." With that, he strode away. "Are you sure we'll be all right, Tilly?" Nancy had always been rather afraid of the large horses that pulled the wagons and carts through the streets of Five Points. The way their eyes rolled when they were spooked and the sheer size of them made her feel they were best avoided. Tilly watched Brody's retreating back and noticed several ladies turning to stare at him with admiring glances. "We'll be just fine," she said. "I don't reckon Brody would suggest it if he didn't think we could manage." Now that they were away from the grimy, crowded streets of New York, she could see Brody was feeling more at home in his natural environment. He had an air of confidence about him that she hadn't seen before, and an easy charm with the frontier folk that only came from a sense of belonging. "He looks more like a rugged cowboy out here, doesn't he?" Nancy said, following Tilly's gaze. She gave her a mischievous smile. "I hope I meet someone just like him when I'm older. I know this is a marriage of convenience, but you could do worse than fall in love with him, you know." Tilly blushed. That had been her thought as well, but if she fell in love with a man who didn't love her back, she was setting herself up for heartbreak, and she couldn't allow that to happen. Chapter 6, Wyoming, 1880. "Just make sure you relax," Brody called over his shoulder. "These horses aren't exactly prime stock, so I doubt they'll bolt, but they won't like it if you're all tensed up and telling them what to do." Tilly tried to suppress a sudden urge to laugh as she bounced in the unfamiliar saddle underneath her. Nancy looked like a natural horseback rider already, so much so that she was too busy gazing around at the beautiful landscape to pay Brody much attention. "Relax, Tilly, for goodness sake," she muttered to herself, not wanting to let the others down. Brody circled back and joined her. "You're still trying to fight it," he said with a patient smile. "Imagine that you're joined to the horse, not a separate being perched on top. She's a well-behaved mare, I can tell. She'll take care of you if you just show her you trust her." Tilly nodded and took a deep breath, making a conscious effort to relax her muscles, which were tensed against being thrown off. As if by magic, the jiggling sense of unbalance stopped, and she felt herself gently swaying in time with the mare's sure-footed steps on the snowy trail instead. "See, I knew you'd get it." Brody felt his chest swell with pride as he saw the glint of satisfaction in Tilly's eyes. "Only because you helped me," Tilly replied. "I feel like our journey has been very one-sided so far, what with you paying for our rail tickets and figuring everything out to get us to Rocky River. I promise I'll be more helpful once we get to the ranch. I can cook and clean, and I'll turn my hand to whatever I can outside if you show me what to do." Brody gave her a concerned look, wondering why she found it so hard to accept a compliment. Was it because she had gotten so few in her past? He had no way of knowing what it would be like being raised in an orphanage, but kindness and encouragement were probably in short supply. It made him want to pay Tilly more compliments, but he worried that she might mistake his intentions as trying to lure her into the sort of situation she had just escaped. "What do you think of Wyoming so far?" he asked. It felt like a safer sort of conversation to have. Tilly felt brave enough to take her eyes off the track ahead for a moment and look around. He could see a look of wonder come over her face as she took in the rolling hills and majestic mountains in the distance. "I'd be happy to live here forever," she blurted out. "I mean, I read a book once about the Wild West, but I never imagined it would look like this. All the space. It makes me feel kind of small, but I don't mind. Back in 5 Points, it was so busy, but nobody really noticed you, if that makes sense. Whereas out here, it seems like neighbors would have to get on and help each other. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. I grew up on a ranch back east, but when my parents died, the bank took it from us. I couldn't keep the place going single-handed, even though our neighbors did whatever they could to help." He felt a pang of regret as he thought back to his childhood when it had felt as though the golden summer days would last forever. "I'm sorry to hear you lost your home," Tilly said softly. "No wonder it means so much to take on Verity's ranch. Did you enjoy working with your pa? I expect he was proud to have a son to take over after him." Brody felt the breath catch in his throat as he thought back to the day he had lost his father. His dying wish was that the ranch would continue in his name, but Brody had only been 11 years old. He had worked until he was so exhausted he could barely stand, but it hadn't been enough. "Pa taught me everything I know. He was a good man," Brody said, with a crack of emotion in his voice. "I pleaded with the bank manager to give me more time, but one of his customers had his eye on the place. I never stood a chance, but the worst thing was that I felt as though I'd let Pa down. I guess there's a part of me that's been trying to make up for it ever since, trying to become the man he wanted me to be." "When you start work at Verity's ranch, you'll be able to do it in honor of your pa and her," Tilly replied with a kind smile. "I think that would be a fitting way to continue your pa's legacy, even if it's not on his ranch, don't you?" Brody nodded and nudged his horse to trot ahead as the track started to climb toward a ridge of woodland. The more time he was spending with Tilly, the more he was struggling to understand his feelings toward her. He had never shared his hopes and regrets this freely with Anna, but there was something about Tilly's frank, green-eyed gaze and the way she seemed to accept what he was saying without judgment that made him reveal his innermost thoughts, whether he had intended to or not. A sudden gust of cold wind made Brody rein his horse to a stop. He looked at the landscape ahead with the practiced eye of someone used to working outside with nature. In the distance, snow clouds were starting to build again, and it wouldn't be long until darkness fell. "We won't make it to Rocky River today," he said, once Tilly and Nancy had caught up. "I reckon if we ride toward the woods, we'll have a better chance of finding shelter. It's looking like we might get more snow soon, and I don't want to ride through the night." Nancy's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Won't there be wild animals in the woods?" Brody tapped the rifle he had holstered on his saddle. "Yep, there are gray wolves and bears around these parts. But if we make a fire, they'll leave us alone. Most folks don't realize that they're pretty shy creatures. You just have to be sure not to aggravate them." They rode on in silence for a few minutes, and just as he'd said, the first few flakes of snow started to drift down. They had already been in the saddle for hours, and Tilly was longing to get down and stretch her legs. "What's that up ahead?" She pointed toward a natural dip in the ground, where the snow seemed to be banked up against something. "Well spotted. It looks like the remains of an old shack." Brody was grateful for her sharp eyesight. He had been hoping to see a sturdy tree that he could build a shelter under for the night, but if there was a ruined shack, it would be better. He jumped down and tethered his horse to take a closer look. "Stay here in the open until I check that it's safe." He didn't want to tell them that he had been looking out for bandits and scare them. This was exactly the sort of terrain they would favor to hide out in. As he got closer to the shack, he could see that there were no footprints in the snow. It was only 3 walls and the remains of a shingled roof, but it would keep the worst of the snow off them for a few hours while they rested until daybreak. The door hung off its hinges, and a couple of rats scuttled away as he peered inside. There was no sign that anyone had stayed there recently, and he heaved a sigh of relief. "This will do," he said happily, going back outside. "It's not as smart as what you were used to under the arches, but at least it's only us using the place," he added, bringing a smile to Tilly's face. "No expense spared, I see," she replied, raising one eyebrow with amusement. She eased herself down off the horse and winced as her aching muscles complained. "You'll both be saddle sore for a few days," Brody said as he helped Nancy down. "After that, once you get accustomed to horseback riding, you'll be able to go for hours and not feel sore at all." Tilly and Nancy busied themselves, making the shack a little more presentable while Brody tethered the horses. There was an old broom in the corner, with half its bristles missing, but Nancy was able to sweep the dried leaves off the rickety table and from the corners of the room, while Tilly used a rag to clean the cobwebs away. Although the work helped their muscles loosen up again, it was still bitterly cold, and they thought longingly of a crackling campfire to give them some comfort. "I'm going to see if I can shoot a couple of rabbits. I've had a good look around, and there are plenty of twigs and branches under the trees over yonder to make a fire. I won't be long. I've already spotted some rabbit tracks in the snow. Nancy just found an old pot and a wooden spoon we can use for cooking. Are you sure there's nothing else we can get on with while you're gone?" "You're not used to this sort of wilderness, Tilly. I'd be happier knowing that you're both staying in the shack until I get back." Brody tucked the rifle under his arm and hurried along the track, keeping a close eye on the ground. The rabbit tracks weren't hard to follow, but they were older than he would have liked, which meant he would be away longer than he'd hoped for. Although he had purchased some bread and apples back in Hudsonville, he wanted to provide more for Tilly and Nancy. Don't go getting too attached to them. The thought sprang up in his mind unexpectedly. Tilly's heart-shaped face and willingness to try and learn new things were tugging on his emotions in a way that he hadn't bargained for. And the way she cared for young Nancy, as though she was her sister, was admirable, and brought out his own protective streak, too. He had thought it would take him a long time to get over Anna ending their relationship, but with hindsight, and if he was being honest with himself, he had never felt as drawn to her the way he was with Tilly. They had been too different. Kind of ironic, seeing as Tilly isn't even a country woman. He shook his head with a rueful smile, wondering why matters of the heart had to be quite so complicated. 2 rabbits suddenly zigzagged across the snow from behind a rock, and he raised his gun and shot them both with swift precision before tying them onto his belt. He quickly kicked the snow where the rabbits had fallen with his boot to bury the scent. There were gray wolves in these parts, and he hoped they would stay higher up in the mountains. But he didn't want to risk attracting them with the spatter of fresh blood. The sun was starting to sink, casting long shadows, and Brody decided that he had enough for one meal. His mouth was already watering at the idea of roast rabbit in the old pot Nancy had found with fresh bread to mop up the juices, and he whistled softly under his breath as he retraced his footsteps toward the shack. It would only take him 10 minutes to collect wood for the fire, and they would be warm in no time. "Ever skinned a rabbit before?" he called as he nudged the wooden door of the shack open. "I managed to bag 2 of them, which will make a nice dinner for us." Nancy looked up from where she had been laying out their blankets on the wooden chairs, trying to make them more comfortable. "We used to do them now and again if we were sent to work in the kitchen in the orphanage. I'm sure I can remember how to do it if you give me a knife." "Where's Tilly?" Brody laid his rifle and the rabbits on the table. He hadn't noticed her by the horses on his way back. "She's fetching wood to make the fire. You'll soon learn that she doesn't like to be idle, Brody. She figured it would save you from having to do it. Now you come to mention it, she's been gone a while." A ripple of alarm made Brody snatch up his gun again. "Did you see which way she went?" Nancy's face creased with worry at his tone. "She followed the track toward the trees over there." "Why? Do you think she's in trouble?" The sound of a low growl suddenly drifted toward them in the gathering dusk, followed by huffing noises. And some birds clattered up into the sky in alarm. "Stay here," Brody commanded, giving Nancy a fierce look. She nodded hastily. "Don't let her come to any harm." Brody ran along the track, staying low and soft-footed. It was almost dark under the canopy of the pine trees, and it took him a moment for his eyesight to adjust. He paused and listened. The sound reached his ears again, this time closer and away over on his right, where the trees were thicker. The timbre of it was low, almost like a vibration through the ground, but he knew it signaled danger for Tilly. He edged forward, his gun raised, ready to shoot. A movement caught his eye, and he saw Tilly frozen on the spot with her arms full of fallen wood. Staring straight at her was a large bear, and it reared onto its hind legs and huffed again, sniffing the air. Terror was etched on Tilly's face, and even from this distance, he could tell she was about to scream. In one fluid movement, Brody lifted the barrel of his rifle and let off a shot high overhead. The bullet ricocheted through the branches, and the bear turned and lumbered back into the shadows. I'm sorry. I just wanted to help." Tilly's words came out as a faint gasp as Brody ran toward her. "You're all right now, I promise." Brody dropped his gun and pulled her into his arms. She was trembling violently, and he rubbed her back gently, whispering quietly into her hair. "You didn't do anything wrong. She was probably just out looking for food and heard us at the shack. Hush, Tilly, it's over now." As the shadows grew denser, a shaft of weak sunlight filtered through the trees as the sun sank toward the mountain ridge on the horizon. Brody felt Tilly's trembling gradually stop and the rigid tenseness of her muscles relax. "I just want to do right by Nancy," Tilly whispered against his chest. Brody held her softly encircled in his arms as her shock turned to tears. The sobs came from deep within her chest, not just because of the fright of seeing the bear, but for everything that had befallen her until that moment. The sadness of having no family of her own, the cruelty of the way Norman had treated her like something he owned to be handed around, and the terror of trying to keep herself and Nancy safe from the danger of living on the streets with nobody to turn to for help. "You're safe now," Brody whispered over and over. "I won't ever let anything bad happen to you and Nancy, I promise." Gradually, the agonized sobs faded to quiet tears, and then a few minutes later, her breath became slow and even again. Tilly looked up at him, her lashes still damp from the storm of emotions that had swept over her, and she gave him a tremulous smile. Brody's heart lifted with happiness as he looked into her green eyes. The shadows which had always chased across her expression had gone, and she seemed somehow lighter, as though she had thrown off the shackles of her past. "Thank you for protecting me." Her voice was soft, and the simple words were heartfelt, as though an invisible bond had grown between them. "We'd better get back and light the fire," Brody replied. He would happily have stayed with Tilly in his arms for longer, but he knew that Nancy would be worried about them. Let's gather a few more pieces of wood on the way back. I shot 2 rabbits, so we'll be eating well tonight, he added lightly. They fell into step together, picking up sticks, and Tilly's eyes lit up as she saw Nancy hurrying toward them when the shack came into sight. He watched the 2 of them hug, and the way that Tilly was quick to downplay the danger she had been in so as not to frighten Nancy. Don't get too fond of her. The thought popped up in his head again. But with each hour he was spending in Tilly's company, it was getting harder and harder to tell himself that this was purely a relationship of convenience. Chapter 7. Rocky River, Wyoming. What a charming town this is. After another day in the saddle, Tilly was confident enough in her mare to know she could safely look around their destination without worrying about falling off. I thought Hudsonville was nice, but Rocky River is even better, Nancy agreed. Now you can see why I was so eager to leave New York. Brody trotted along next to them with a broad smile on his face. There's space to breathe out west. As they came to the outskirts of the town, a few people had already nodded greetings to them as if they were friends. And it took Tilly a moment to realize that it wasn't because they actually knew Brody, but just because that's what people did out here. There had been a fresh fall of snow when they left the shack at daybreak, and it made Tilly's mind turn toward the festive season. It was still a couple of months away, but she was already imagining carol singers around a large tree in the park and candles twinkling in the windows of the stores as she and Brody walked through town, arm in arm, through the crisp white snow. She risked a sidelong glance at his rugged profile. Since Brody had comforted her against the reassuring solidity of his broad chest the day before, she noticed that her pulse quickened every time their eyes met. And she couldn't help but hope that perhaps love could blossom between them, somehow. The man I bought our supplies from in Hudsonville told me the lawyer's office is in the center of Rocky River. Mr. Layton said I should visit there to show him my documents, as he will take care of legal matters at this end. He'll probably be able to tell us where the nearest pastor is as well, so we can get married before heading out to the ranch. Brody's words were casual, as though what they were doing was perfectly normal, but the heat flooded Tilly's cheeks at the mention of marriage. Do you think I could freshen up? Before? Well, you know. Tilly could barely bring herself to say the words. She had wanted to be a wife for as long as she could remember. Shivering under her thin blanket, watching the moonlight through the high windows of the orphanage dormitory night after night, she had imagined herself in an elegant gown, looking deep into the eyes of her husband as the pastor declared them man and wife, with her parents proudly looking on. It had been just a fantasy, of course, but now that the actual day of her wedding had arrived, it was a jarring departure from her cherished dream. I guess, Brody scratched his chin. I hadn't thought about that, sorry. They rode on in silence for a few moments, and then Nancy pointed toward a building with a sign out the front. What about the Rosebush Inn? Look, it says they have vacancies. I don't want anything fancy, Tilly said hastily. She was mindful that Brody might not have much money left. Just somewhere to wash my face and a mirror so I can do my hair. Let's stop there, Brody agreed. It will give me a chance to ask where things are in Rocky River anyway. An hour later, Tilly was pleased she had suggested the break. The proprietors of the inn, Suzanne and Eli Perez, were welcoming, and when she had shyly explained that she was getting married, Suzanne had insisted on giving her one of her hair ribbons and letting her use one of the guest rooms to freshen up, even though they weren't staying the night. You've paid for a hot meal. It's the least I can do, she said, showing Tilly to one of their rooms out the back that was furnished in a plain but comfortable way. We get lots of mail-order brides staying here before their weddings. My husband, Eli, always says I'm too soft, but a wedding day should be special, don't you think? Her chatter helped calm Tilly's nerves, and although she didn't have anything smarter to change into, Nancy had managed to tame her curls, and the green ribbon brought out the color of her eyes. For a moment, as Suzanne dabbed lavender water on her shawl and complimented Tilly on her creamy complexion, exclaiming that Brody was a lucky man to call her his wife, she could almost imagine that it was the wedding she had always dreamt of. Now, as she went back outside to get on her horse again, Suzanne waved her off, and Tilly realized they had already made a new friend. "Be sure to stay in touch," Suzanne called as they trotted away. "Come and visit next time you're in town for supplies. And I wish you a very happy marriage. God bless you both on this wonderful day." "So, you're the person who will be inheriting Buckthorn Ranch, huh?" John Green, the lawyer, gave Brody and Tilly a curious stare from behind his large walnut-inlaid desk. After a moment, he smiled at them, but Tilly noticed that it didn't reach his eyes. In fact, there was something sly about his expression that made her wonder whether he had their best interests at heart. She had never had dealings with professionals like him, but he reminded her of Mr. Walsh in the way that he seemed rather full of himself. "Yes, I am." Brody watched as the lawyer carefully read the letter he had presented several times. "I've never been to Wyoming before. If you could give us directions to the ranch, I'd appreciate it." Brody turned his hat in his hands. "And we need to book the pastor as a matter of urgency. We didn't have time to get married on the way out here because I figured we should get here as quickly as we could when Mr. Layton said Mrs. Clay didn't have long to live." Mr. Green's gaze lingered on Tilly for a beat longer than was polite, and she felt the heat rising to her cheeks. She tucked her hand into the crook of Brody's arm. "Do you think the pastor will be able to fit us in? Suzanne at the Rosebush Inn said he's used to not needing much notice, what with so many mail-order brides coming out west." The lawyer stood up and gave them a hesitant smile tinged with concern on their behalf. "If I understand things correctly from Mr. Layton in New York, your inheritance only stands if you are married to one another. If that's the case, you have a problem, I'm afraid. The regular pastor is out of town at the moment. It's not uncommon for him to visit outlying properties for funerals. He might be gone for a few days." Brody's face fell. "Are you sure? We wanted to arrive at the ranch as man and wife. Mrs. Clay, my aunt, is expecting us to be married. I mean, we can come back into town in a few days, I suppose, but I'm not sure how unwell my aunt is. She might not have long to live." He realized his comment sounded self-serving. "It's not only about the inheritance. As Mr. Layton reminded me, it's to make a dying woman happy." Mr. Green nodded expansively as though he understood the situation perfectly well. "I can see that she would want to know her nephew is a family man." He paused and gave Brody a shrewd look. "You are definitely her nephew, then? You'd be amazed at the affront of some folks I've dealt with over the years, claiming to be someone they're not, just to get their hands on some money. It goes with the territory in gold mining country. Not that I doubt you, of course," he added with a chuckle. "Of course I am," Brody shot back. "Just ask Mr. Layton." Tilly could feel the tension in his arm, and she smiled up at him to show her support. His expression was hard to read, but she figured it must be because of the lawyer's officious manner. Like Brody often said, he was a simple man most at home working with cattle and horses, not dealing with lawyers in fancy offices. "In that case, I can help you out. I have a friend staying with me at the moment who is a traveling pastor. He doesn't have a church of his own yet, and he's only passing through, but at least it means you can be officially married today. I can even sign your marriage license, so it's all above board." Tilly tried to quell her disappointment. Although she didn't always attend church every week, she had always assumed she would get married in a place of worship under the eyes of the Lord. As if reading her mind, Mr. Green hurried to reassure her. "I'm only suggesting it as I believe Mrs. Clay doesn't have long to live. If she passes on within the next few days, I'm sure it will please her greatly to know that her nephew is married to a lovely young lady. But of course, if you'd rather wait..." He shrugged. "I'd hate to see you disappoint Mrs. Clay. Who knows, perhaps the pastor will be back next week, as long as he doesn't get held up with these wretched snowstorms." Tilly pushed her own wishes aside. "The Lord will bless our marriage no matter where it happens, I'm sure. Faith isn't limited to a particular dwelling. We'd be very grateful if your friend could minister to us and you can do the license." What matters most is for Brody to spend time with his aunt, as we don't know how long they will have to be together. You have a very understanding wife, Mr. Green said, nodding at Brody. Besides, you can ask the regular pastor to bless your union when he returns. The church is always quite delightful at Christmas. Thank you, Brody said, reaching across to shake Mr. Green's hand. Tilly wondered whether she had misjudged the lawyer. He certainly seemed to want to help them out. That's settled then. If you come back an hour from now, my friend, Pastor Yoder, will conduct your wedding, and you can be on your way. As Tilly and Brody left, John Green watched them through the window with a thoughtful expression on his face. He hadn't realized that Verity Clay had a long-lost nephew or that she intended to leave the ranch to him. He picked up his hat and pulled his coat on to go and fetch his friend, thinking about the fertile land and prime location of Buckthorn Ranch. If it hadn't been for Brody Kinney turning up desperate to continue Mrs. Clay's ranching legacy, he wouldn't have minded making an offer on the place himself. He wondered whether Brody might be open to selling the ranch once Mrs. Clay was out of the picture. In his opinion, most people were willing to let go of their principles pretty fast if the price was right. I now pronounce you man and wife. Pastor Yoder gave Tilly a broad smile, even though it seemed as though he was having trouble focusing on her. That's it. We're all done, he added, nodding at Brody. Mr. Green will sort my fee out later. He stumbled slightly and then weaved his way back out of the lawyer's office, patting Nancy on the shoulder as he went. May the Lord bless you with a large family, he hiccuped. The outer door slammed closed behind him, and Brody mouthed an apology to Tilly. Don't mind that he's had a few tots of whiskey, Mr. Green said smoothly, rolling his eyes slightly. He only takes it because he says it helps ease his gout. You're married now. That's what matters. Are you sure he's a proper pastor? Tilly asked doubtfully. She had never realized a marriage ceremony would be so short. Of course, Mr. Green said firmly. He dipped his pen in the inkwell and then signed the marriage license with a flourish before blotting it carefully and sliding it toward them. I guess we were expecting something a little more meaningful. Brody tried to search for the right word without wanting to offend the lawyer who was doing so much to help him out. As your dear wife said earlier, faith is not diminished by not being in a church, and I'm sure the Lord will look kindly upon you for wanting to do what's right for your aunt. He smiled and ushered them toward the door. If you leave now, you should be at Buckthorn Ranch before it gets dark. Brody offered Tilly his arm, and she felt her spirits rise. It might have been an unconventional ceremony, but she was now the wife of a handsome gentleman who had already proven that he would go to any lengths to protect her and Nancy. If only we could stay married, she thought inwardly. The powerful urge to want to remain as Brody's wife almost took Tilly's breath away. It felt like a cruel twist of fate that she was falling in love with the man she had only agreed to marry for convenience to help each other out. I must keep my feelings secret. It's not fair to expect more when he has already done so much for Nancy and me. The next thoughts rattled through her mind, and she tried to keep the smile on her face. It was harder than she thought, trying to conceal her true feelings from Brody, whilst also endeavoring to convince the lawyer that they were marrying for love. She was already worried about how the marriage would be dissolved once Brody no longer needed them to be together. You make a fine-looking couple. If you don't mind me saying, Mr. and Mrs. Kinney, follow the directions I gave you. The ranch isn't hard to find. As Tilly and Brody hurried toward where the horses were hitched, the lawyer's parting words floated after them. If you need me for anything else, just come to my office. I'm always happy to help clients with other things. Brody's expression was hard to read as he checked that the horses were ready to be ridden again, and Nancy stamped her feet to get warm, impatient to meet the mysterious Mrs. Clay and see what the ranch would be like. Tilly looked back and saw the lawyer standing on the snow-covered steps outside his office, watching them getting ready to leave. She couldn't help but wonder if she would be back in Mr. Green's office sooner than expected to undo the marriage vows to the man who had stolen her heart. The thought gave her a wrench of disappointment. Ready for the last part of our journey? Brody's soulful brown eyes were full of affection as he helped Tilly up onto her mare, and she knew with sudden certainty that she would happily live with him for the rest of her days. But that's not what we agreed. She picked up her reins, and her thoughts turned toward their next destination, Buckthorn Ranch, and meeting Brody's aunt, Verity Clay. Chapter 8. Rocky River, Wyoming. How wonderful to see you again, Brody. After all these years. Tilly and Nancy waited discreetly on the wide veranda of the log cabin at Buckthorn Ranch as Verity Clay greeted her nephew. The old woman blinked back her tears of joy as she took hold of Brody's arm and gave him a beaming smile. Although she needed a cane to walk, her health didn't seem as dire as Tilly had expected, which pleased her. She hoped it would give Brody more time to spend with his aunt. "Let me take a proper look at you." Verity turned Brody toward the light and gave him a searching look, as though she was examining every detail of his face. He shifted uncomfortably beneath her gaze. "I can see you didn't inherit your pa's features, although perhaps that's no bad thing," she finally pronounced with a wry smile. "But I reckon you've gotten his love of working the land. Am I right?" Brody nodded. "Ranching is all I've ever dreamt of doing, Mrs. Clay. I spent a few weeks in New York for Mr. Layton's meeting, but that was more than enough for me." "And this must be your delightful wife?" Verity's eyes twinkled as she prompted Brody to introduce his traveling companions. "Uh-huh. Sorry, I forgot my manners. This is Tilly, my wife, and Nancy, her sister." He sounded hesitant, stumbling over his words, but Verity didn't seem to notice. She hobbled forward, stooping over her cane to greet them. "This is a beautiful ranch," Tilly said as she gazed at what lay beyond the homestead. And she meant it. The log cabin was set at the top of a hill that commanded a far-reaching view of the paddocks which lay beyond the orchard and kitchen garden. In the middle distance, the land rose into steep mountain terrain, where the last few leaves clung to the trees, and a wide river snaked its way down toward the town they had just ridden from. It had only taken them an hour. "It's the perfect distance from Rocky River," Nancy had commented as they trotted up the track on their arrival. "I have to agree. It is beautiful, and I never get tired of this view," Verity said. "My husband, Lenny, found this land when he was out fur trapping one day. Lord rest his soul. We were blessed to have many happy years here, although for the last few of them, it's just been me minding the place." Tilly immediately felt drawn to Verity Clay and her indomitable spirit. Most women would have sold up and chosen an easier life in town. Obviously, the ranch meant a lot to her, and she had been determined to continue working with the land and animals the same way she had always done with her husband. "It must have been hard doing everything alone, Mrs. Clay." The old woman gave her a shrewd look. "You must call me Verity, dear. And yes, some days were hard. But I always knew it was what Lenny would have wanted, which is what made the difficult days bearable. That and kind-hearted neighbors, of course." "It's good to know you've had some help," Brody said. "I sure am looking forward to getting to work." As Verity showed them to their rooms, Tilly realized an uncomfortable truth that she hadn't faced up to until then. She would have to share a bed with Brody. The bedroom was plainly furnished, but cozy, and there was only one bed. Thankfully, there was also a small room available for Nancy to use, and Verity made no comment about the fact that she hadn't expected 3 guests to arrive. "I'll head on out and check the cattle, shall I?" Brody said, looking slightly flustered as Verity fetched a faded patchwork quilt and draped it on their bed. "I hope you don't mind that the furniture is a little worn," Verity said, giving them both an apologetic smile. "Any spare money we had tended to get spent on the ranch. That's just the way it is when you have animals. Nancy and I grew up in an orphanage. We're not sisters by birth, but we've always been together as though we are real sisters," Tilly explained, wanting Verity to understand a little of her background. "You might think the furniture is worn, but all I see is a wonderful cozy log cabin that bears the marks of your history." As Verity hobbled away, Tilly allowed her thoughts to drift for a few moments. She could imagine the sound of her and Brody's children playing outside on the veranda on a summer's evening as she prepared dinner for the family, and seeing Brody tending to the animals in the distance. In her mind's eye, She could almost hear the languid buzz of insects lazily drifting over the flowers she would plant in the garden, and see the sunbeams catching the tousled heads of their children as her heart overflowed with gratitude for the life they had together. "It's got potential. I reckon I can make a go of this, don't you?" Brody's muttered question from the doorway of the bedroom brought Tilly back to the present with a disappointing thump of reality. He had returned to make sure she was all right. She nodded, feeling suddenly sad. Even though he had casually asked for her opinion, she could tell he was already talking about his future here without her. "It's wonderful, perfect for you," she told him. "I hadn't thought about having to share the bedroom." Brody had the grace to look apologetic. "We have to share it if we're to look like a proper married couple, but I won't do anything improper." Tilly blushed and nodded. "Thank you. I appreciate you being a gentleman of honor." She changed the subject hastily. "Are you going to look around the barns now? I'd like to come with you if that's all right. I want to help out as much as possible, but I have a lot to learn." Brody brightened. "I'd like that. Nancy is already busy in the kitchen, making herself right at home. We can stable the horses and see what sort of condition the barns are in." As Brody and Tilly hurried across the snow-covered yard to get to work a few minutes later, Verity hobbled over to the veranda to watch them. "See, Lenny, I told you it was the right thing to do," she whispered to herself with a gentle smile. She touched the battered hat of his that still hung by the door, an unconscious gesture that gave her comfort when she was missing him. "Did you say something?" Nancy called. "I have to say, Mrs. Clay, Verity, this is the loveliest log cabin I've ever seen. It's exactly the sort of homey place that Tilly and I used to daydream about when we were at the orphanage. I could tell you a few tales about Matron Fenton." Verity hobbled back into the kitchen, where Nancy was already busy making beef pie for dinner and peeling apples to make a cake. The room smelt of nutmeg, and Verity's old cat, Ginger, was winding himself around Nancy's ankles as though she had always been there. "I'd love to hear about your time at the orphanage," Verity said. She sighed happily as Nancy chattered on. She and Lenny had never been able to have children, but now, in the space of just a few hours, it felt as though Buckthorn Ranch was coming back to life again after the long, lonely years of it just being her there. It had definitely been the right decision to send that letter to Mr. Layton asking him to track her nephew down. Brody seemed to have a good work ethic, and his young wife Tilly was delightful. Nancy, too. Suddenly, the news that the doctor had given her several months ago that she might not have long to live didn't seem so bad, not now that the future of the ranch was secure. The lamplight cast a cozy glow over the table as their first evening meal at the ranch drew to a close, and Tilly could feel weariness starting to steal over her. It was as if all the worries of the last few weeks had suddenly caught up with her, but knowing that she was now somewhere safe for the foreseeable future had allowed her to relax. She stifled a yawn and started to gather up the empty plates to wash. Nancy's beef pie and apple cake had been a great success. "I'll take care of cleaning up the dishes, Nancy. You look worn out." Tilly gave her lifelong friend a pat on the shoulder as she stood up, reminding herself that this unexpected journey must have been hard for her, too. "I'm all right. I don't want anyone to think I'm idle." Nancy's eyelids were starting to droop as she fought sleep. Verity looked at her more closely across the table. "Get yourself off to bed, young lady. It's all this fresh mountain air, I expect. There'll be plenty of time to get accustomed to life on the ranch. You don't have to try and do it all in one day." Nancy nodded and gave Verity a grateful smile. Tilly could already see how fond she was of Brody's aunt. "It's funny, the pace of life seems slower out here than in New York, but I'm shattered." "Early to bed, early to rise," Verity said wisely. "Remember that, and you'll be fine. How about you help me make the plum pudding for Christmas tomorrow? I've never bothered much with Christmas since losing my Lenny, but I'd like this year to be a celebration of you all being here." "I'd love to do that," Nancy said. "Do you remember the time when they gave us that moldy old fruitcake for one Christmas dinner at St. Bartholomew's, Tilly?" Nancy grinned as she pulled her shawl tighter and wandered away. "I'll tell you all about it tomorrow, Verity." Can we put a lucky charm in the plum pudding? We've never been able to make a wish before. I wouldn't have it any other way, Verity said, shooing her away. Tilly bustled around the kitchen, cleaning up, and Verity sat back down again opposite Brody. I'll bring coffee through shortly, Tilly said from the doorway. Ginger jumped up onto Brody's lap, kneading his legs for a moment before curling up and purring loudly. He likes you, Verity commented. That's saying something. He can be a little cantankerous sometimes, and most of my neighbors are wary of him, but he's good at keeping the mice down in the barn. What do you think of the place so far? I know some parts are a bit ramshackle, but there was only so much I could do after Lenny died. Brody smoothed the cat's head, taking his time before answering. I spotted a couple of holes in the barn roof, but you were smart to make sure the hay was stored away from under them. Your cattle look good, better than the last place I was working at. Verity's eyes crinkled in her lined face as she smiled at the compliment. They were Lenny's pride and joy. We didn't have many animals compared to some folks around here. He built the herd up real slow, always picking the best ones to breed from and selling the others. It took time, but over the years, clay cattle were the ones that sold better than most. For the next few minutes, Tilly could hear Brody talking about the previous ranches he had worked on and how it had been a source of frustration to him that the owners always wanted to make a fast buck instead of selecting cattle for the longer term. I think the future is to produce the finest beef and send it to the cities back east, he was saying, as Tilly brought the coffee through. Are you sure? It seems like a long way to send meat. Verity sipped her coffee with a thoughtful look on her face. Just eating your beef pie tonight has shown me how superior your meat is, Brody replied. His eyes were alight with enthusiasm. The beef I ate in New York wasn't a patch on yours, and now they have these newfangled refrigerated railroad carriages. It opens up a lot of opportunity. We'll have to talk more about it over the coming weeks, Verity said. Tilly could see that she was intrigued by the prospect and liked the way Brody was keen to make improvements that would secure the ranch's future. I'll just finish the dishes, and then I'm going to bed. Thank you for making us feel so welcome. Tilly topped up Brody and Verity's cups with more coffee. It looked like they would be talking late into the night. Thank you for making yourselves at home and getting on with things, dear. I know it's probably not easy settling into someone else's house, but Nancy is a delightful girl, and I can already tell that you'll make a good rancher's wife. Verity smiled up at her with a twinkle in her eye. I won't keep Brody too much longer, but I'm fascinated to hear more about his past. It was always a source of great sorrow to me that I fell out with Brody's pa all those years ago. He didn't approve of me marrying Lenny, you see, but I was hot-headed and stubborn and very much in love with Lenny. Tilly left them talking and finished cleaning up in the kitchen. Snatches of conversation drifted through from the dining table, and although she didn't want to eavesdrop, she couldn't help but listen. It gave her a glimpse into Brody's past, which he always seemed reluctant to talk about. After Ma and Pa died, it seemed like no matter how hard I pleaded, the bank manager had already decided I shouldn't be allowed to carry on working there. I don't suppose you remember the barn fire? You were only a baby when it happened. Your ma was terrified that the burns on your back would be painful for the rest of your life. I only knew about it later when I received a letter from an old friend from back east saying what had happened. By then, your pa and I weren't in contact anymore. I was fortunate. The scars healed fairly well and never stopped me from being able to work. Tell me more about Lenny. How did he decide which cattle to breed from? I'd like to learn more. Tilly untied her apron and hung it next to the stove, ready for the morning. She was surprised to hear that Brody had been badly injured in a fire. He had never mentioned it, but then she supposed he figured it was none of her business. Thinking about the scars on his back made her realize she had better hurry to get into bed. It would be hard enough sleeping in the same bed next to a man she barely knew, even if he was behaving like a perfect gentleman, without the awkwardness of changing into her nightgown in front of him. Chapter 9. Whoa there, girl. Easy does it. Tilly reined her mare in a little so the heifer lumbering in front of them wouldn't feel pressured to walk down the mountain track any faster than was comfortable. The snow lay thick on the ground, and it was slow going, but Tilly was in no hurry. It was nice just to be able to breathe in the crisp air and enjoy the way the sun was sparkling off the snow as if the landscape was encrusted in millions of diamonds. Just steer her this way a bit. I've gotten the stall ready for her. Brody appeared in the barn doorway, and he grinned as Tilly got closer. Anyone would think you'd been riding a horse your whole life, not just a couple of months. Like I said before, it's because you're a very patient teacher. Tilly replied with a chuckle. I mean, after falling off at least 10 times, I think I finally managed to remember to let the mare have her head. At least I fell onto snow most times, and the only thing that was bruised was my dignity. The heifer walked ponderously into the stall that was bedded down with thick straw, and Brody swung the door closed behind her. She had somehow managed to escape from her paddock during the night, looking for somewhere to have her calf. But they couldn't risk her being attacked by a mountain cougar. Tilly had ridden out to round her up and bring her home again, while Brody carried on fixing the shingles, which had blown off the barn roof the week before. She was quickly learning that there were always chores to do if you owned animals, but she had never felt happier. Need a hand getting down, ma'am? Brody held on to the mare's reins as Tilly dismounted. Thank you. How much longer do you think it will be until she has the calf? Tilly untacked her horse and led her to the far end of the barn, where the other horses were quietly munching fragrant hay. She hurried back to stand next to Brody, who was leaning over the top of the gate, watching the heifer closely. Their elbows touched, and she could feel the heat of his body next to hers, which made her pulse quicken. I'd say an hour, maybe less. It's her first calf, so I want to stay nearby in case she needs help. His tone was light, but Tilly knew how much it meant to him. This was the first calf to be born since they had arrived at Buckthorn Ranch, and he would hate for anything to go wrong. I've finished my chores, and Nancy is busy preparing the food for Christmas Day. Do you mind if I stay and watch? I'd like nothing better, Brody said softly. It's a special birth, so it's only right that you're here with me. He turned to look at her and smiled. You have straw in your hair. Hold on a minute, and let me get it out. Without waiting for her reply, Brody brushed the straw away and let his hand rest on her shoulder. Can you believe we've been here 2 months already? Tilly murmured, feeling flustered. Suddenly, her mouth felt dry and her heart skipped a beat at how close Brody was to her. Although they had shared a bed for all that time, he had been scrupulously polite, lying with his back turned to her so that she wouldn't feel he was taking advantage of the situation. The trouble was that Tilly longed for him to take her in his arms. She just hadn't dared to tell him how she felt about him. You're very beautiful, Tilly, Brody said hesitantly. I know we agreed that this was a marriage of convenience, but there's something I need to say. What is it? Tilly asked. The heat flooded her cheeks as he ran his hand down her arm and took hold of her hand. I have feelings for you, Tilly, he told her. I know I have no right to expect anything back from you, but I hoped maybe you could consider us being a proper married couple. Tilly saw the pulse beating in Brody's neck as he looked deep into her eyes. I have feelings for you too, Brody. Tilly felt her legs starting to tremble. It felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice. If she was going to surrender her heart to him, she knew there could be no going back. Before she could utter another word, Brody had cupped her face in his hands and was kissing her. As their lips met, Tilly gasped. His kiss was hot and passionate, more full of love than anything she ever could have imagined, and she felt herself being drawn toward him as though powerless to stop herself. Suddenly, there was a low bellow from the stall, and she sprang back from his embrace. I think the calf is on its way, she said, patting her hair back into place and breathing deeply to try and steady her racing pulse. Perfect timing, Brody joked. Could you fill the bucket with water and fetch me some soap? I think she's going to need a hand. As it happened, it was a good thing that they had brought the heifer back to the barn. Her first calf was large, and it took all of Brody's strength and knowledge to help her deliver it. 2 hours later, The newborn calf finally scrambled to stand up, shaking its head in a dazed fashion, and Tilly was able to guide it to the life-giving milk, where it happily started suckling. She'll make a good mother, this one. She's a fighter, and the calf is perfect, strong and inquisitive already, which is what I like to see. Brody smiled wearily at Tilly. I couldn't have done it without you, though, so thank you. Let's hope the next one goes smoother for us. Tilly felt a warm thrill of satisfaction for the fact that she had genuinely played a part in helping bring the new calf into the world, which would benefit the ranch, but also because something about Brody's demeanor had changed. He was looking at her with newfound respect, and his words implied that they had a future together. It wasn't just the fact that they had kissed, although Tilly's pulse still quickened as she recalled the moment of tender passion as their lips had met. It was also that she had felt a sense of closeness between them over the last few weeks, as they had worked side by side on the ranch and talked about their day in the evenings. Verity always set the conversation going after Nancy had gone to bed. But Tilly had noticed that recently Verity would then slip away herself, too. It was almost as if she wanted to make sure that the last quiet hour of the evening would be a time for Brody and Tilly's bond of friendship to slowly flourish and strengthen. It's easy to let the ranch dominate your lives and forget that first, the Lord brought you together as man and wife, not just working partners, Verity had advised her a few days ago as they were cooking dinner together. Lenny and I always made sure to share our hopes and dreams. Our troubles and heartaches, too. That's what makes a strong marriage. Tilly had been grateful for the old woman's motherly wisdom, even though at that time she didn't even know whether Brody would want her to remain as his wife. I'll feed the horses before going in to help Nancy, Tilly called to Brody from the end of the barn. It was only 2 days until Christmas, and Nancy was more excited than she had ever seen her. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and there was an air of anticipation in the homestead that was wonderful to see. Tilly was glad that she and Nancy were finally able to enjoy a proper family Christmas. I'll be in shortly. I just need to wash, and then I'm going to check that the cattle outside all have enough hay until the morning. A few minutes later, Tilly shook the dust from her dress and closed the barn door behind her. All that was left to do outside was to collect the eggs. The chickens were laying well, and she tipped some grain into a bucket to take to the coop. As she hurried around the side of the barn, she almost bumped into Brody. His shirt was off, and he was sluicing icy cold water from the pump over his head and shoulders and scrubbing his arms clean after calving the heifer. It was the first time she had ever seen him without his shirt on, and the sight of his muscular chest made her blush. I'm sorry. I thought you'd already left to check the cattle, she stuttered. She thought back to the conversation she had overheard when Verity had talked about the terrible fire which had injured him and wondered whether he was worried she might find his scars repellent. I decided to fill the water troughs up first, Brody said easily. He turned around to reach for his shirt. Tilly was surprised to see that the skin on his back was smooth and still bore a faint tan from the summer. Your back? You don't have any scars from the fire? She blurted out. I heard Verity talking about how badly injured you were. Brody stiffened, and his expression changed. He hastily pulled the shirt back over his head. There were 2 little boys at the orphanage who were burnt in a fire, and I remember what their scars looked like, Tilly continued slowly. I don't understand, Brody. What's going on? Brody hesitated, and she thought for a moment he was going to ignore her. But then he stepped forward to take her hands in his. Remember I told you that you were a better person than me? Yes, but it's not true, Tilly replied. Now we've gotten to know each other. I know you're a good man, Brody. You're kind-hearted and thoughtful, and I can tell that you've made your Aunt Verity very happy. She felt a ripple of apprehension as she saw a shadow of sadness in Brody's eyes. I've thought long and hard about what I need to do, Brody continued. He lowered his gaze to the ground for a moment as though fighting an internal battle. I see the way that you like to think the best of people and how you're raising Nancy to follow the Lord's teachings, and it's made me want to become the sort of person who you would admire, Tilly. But I already do admire you. Tilly shot back. I know our marriage was one of convenience, but you did it because you wanted the best for your aunt and Buckthorn Ranch. Brody sighed. There's more to it than that. He reluctantly let go of Tilly's hands and pulled his coat back on. I need to do the right thing, Tilly. I'll feed the cattle, then I'll come inside and explain everything. I owe it to all of you. As Tilly watched Brody walk away, she felt a sense of foreboding. She had never seen him looking so troubled. She thought back to a few nights earlier when she had gotten up in the middle of the night to fetch a glass of water. Brody had been outside in the moonlight, his head bent in prayer, and now the anguished words that she had heard him say made more sense. Help me, Lord. Show me the path to take and what I must do to make things right. She didn't know what was causing him such turmoil, but Tilly wanted to do whatever she could to help ease his worries. After feeding the chickens, she walked to her favorite spot in the garden and brushed the snow off the bench so she could sit down. The view of the snowy paddocks with the mountains beyond that seemed to cradle their land, never failed to inspire her. She could see the Lord's majesty in all of it, from the tiny birds that chirped in the trees nearby to the way the river glittered in the winter sun. From the close connection she felt to Verity, to the expanding circle of friends they had started to make in Rocky River, Tilly felt deep in her heart that this was where they were meant to be. But she sensed that Brody was having second thoughts. She pressed her hands together and closed her eyes, turning to her faith to guide them through the coming days. Lord, please forgive me for the part I have played in marrying Brody for convenience. I have harbored a secret love for him for many weeks now, and I believe he loves me too. I pray that you will show me the path to take and guide me to understand what is best for the people I love and care so much about. I see your bounteous blessings all around us, and I am truly grateful for everything that has led to this point. Please give me the courage to hear Brody's words with kindness and acceptance, and the wisdom to know how to respond. In your great mercy, Lord, Amen. Chapter 10. Verity's knitting needles clacked as she completed the last few rows of the shawl she was making for Nancy. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Ginger was curled up next to her feet, purring loudly. It was the happiest Christmas she could remember since losing her dear Lenny, and she murmured a few words of thanks to the Lord under her breath that she had been blessed with living long enough to enjoy this special festive season. The last time the doctor had called in, under the guise of wanting a cup of coffee, but also to check on how she was feeling, he was surprised that the rattling in her lungs had gotten a lot better. He had called it a miracle, and she was inclined to agree. But really, she knew that the miracle was how the Lord had brought Brody, Tilly, and Nancy into her life. What do you think, Verity? Shall I put this at the top of the tree? Nancy's cheeks were rosy from where she had been busy beating the rugs outside in a frenzy of cleaning, ready for the big day. She held a sparkly star out for Verity to see. I learned how to make these at the orphanage. We only had scraps of paper back then, but this fabric and the sequins from the dressmaker's offcuts are perfect, don't you think? Verity put her knitting down and smiled as Nancy clambered onto a chair to place the star at the top of the tree. Brody had cut it down in the woods a few days earlier, and the room now smelled deliciously of pine resin. She and Lenny had never bothered with a Christmas tree, but the way Nancy's eyes had lit up when Brody suggested it was a delight, so she had willingly agreed to the idea. I reckon all the neighbors will want one of those next year, Verity commented. You're good at making things, Nancy. Perhaps the dressmaker might be able to offer you work someday? That's what I'm hoping, Nancy said. She stood back to admire the tree. She had made paper decorations and bows from strips of red flannel, as well as strings of dried fruit. All they needed now was the candles, but they wouldn't be lit until Christmas Day itself. I think this is the most perfect Christmas we've ever had, Verity. I quite agree, Tilly said, stamping the snow off her boots in the doorway. I can't wait to see the carol singers after church. Rocky River already looks magical compared to 5 Points. Only 2 more days to go. Nancy could barely contain her excitement. Tilly took the fresh eggs she had collected into the kitchen and then busied herself for the next hour with cooking a beef stew for dinner. Regardless of what Brody had to say, the family needed feeding, and the familiar actions of chopping and stirring helped keep her racing thoughts in check. A sudden draught of cold air told her that Brody had returned home, and she quickly assembled a pot of coffee and some cups on a tray, as well as a slice of fruitcake. It was a long time since breakfast, and she knew Brody hadn't eaten anything since then. Tilly, Nancy, Verity, would you all come to the table, please? I have something I need to tell you about. Tilly hurried through and poured out 4 cups of coffee. In spite of her best intentions to stay calm, her heart was hammering fit to burst out of her chest, and Brody's serious expression did nothing to help. Is the new calf all right? Verity hobbled over to the table and sat in her usual chair, sounding slightly breathless. Yes, it'll be a fine one to breed from in the future, I reckon, Brody said absent-mindedly. Nancy strolled in and passed the cups of coffee around. I hope you're not going to tell us we can't go into town on Christmas Day. Even if I had to walk on foot, I don't want to miss the carol singers and seeing all our new friends. I love it here, she added happily. Her comment made Brody look even more serious, and he coughed awkwardly as he sat down. It's not about Christmas Day or the new calf. Before I say what I need to tell you, I want you all to know that these last 2 months have been the best of my whole life. He looked around the table at each of them in turn. I have prayed about this and wrestled with my conscience. My pa was as honest as the day is long, and if I'm ever to become the man he would want me to be, I have to be honest as well. Why don't you start at the beginning, Brody? Verity said with a kind smile. She reached across to pat his hand. I can see that being here at Buckthorn Ranch has been good for you, and I'm very grateful that you traveled all this way just because of the wishes of an old woman. Take your time. There's no rush. Brody flushed and took a gulp of his coffee. I need to go back to when I was 11, when everything changed. I told you that sometime after my parents died, I had to leave our ranch. It was the only home I had ever known. When Pa got sick, I promised him I would do everything I could to keep the ranch going. Tilly shot him a sympathetic smile. She knew it had cut deep that he hadn't been able to fulfill that promise. I was lucky enough to find plenty of work on other ranches, though, Brody continued. I worked hard and got by, but it was never the same as having my own place. I know what you mean, Verity agreed. That's what Lenny used to say as well before we cleared this land to make it our own. Tilly thought Verity's comment would have pleased Brody, but if his pained expression was anything to go by, it troubled him more than he was already. Working on different ranches has given you more experience to draw on now, she said, trying to show him there was nothing wrong with moving around. You're kind, but there's more to my story. Brody paused for another gulp of coffee and to order his thoughts. A couple of years ago, I found work in Kansas on the cattle drives. There were 10 of us working the cattle, and the money was decent. After I was there for a month, a new cowboy joined us. By a strange coincidence, his name was Brody as well. It got pretty confusing, as you can imagine, so to make it easier, the other men called him Billy instead. We became good friends because he'd grown up on a ranch and lost his folks to illness, too, at about the same age I did. It was almost like we'd lived through the same things, just in different parts of the country. Good friends are one of God's blessings, Verity murmured. Tilly poured out more coffee, and Brody looked down into his cup for so long that she wondered if that was all he wanted to say. There's no easy way to share the next part, but I guess I just have to plow on. Brody's eyes clouded with worry and regret. There were plenty of bandits and outlaws along the routes we took. One day in the fall, we were attacked. It turned out one of the other men in our team had told a gang of cattle rustlers where we would be. There was a gunfight, and Billy was hurt real bad. They stole over 100 cattle. I did my best to try and save Billy's life, and he hung on for days. He was the bravest man I ever met, but I couldn't keep him alive for long enough to get to a doctor. Brody's voice cracked with emotion as he remembered losing his friend. It was brave of you to try and save him, Verity said. She nodded to herself. I've met many folks who wouldn't have bothered, I can tell you. I expect you were still in some danger yourself. You were a good friend to him until the end. That would have comforted him." "I hope so," Brody murmured. He cleared his throat again and took a deep breath. "The sheriffs came looking for the man who had told the cattle rustlers where we would be, and somehow my name got mentioned to them. I found myself running from the law, even though I swear to you I would never have done such a thing. I loved working those cattle, and it was a good job." He sounded shocked even now that it could have happened. "Anyway, I drifted from job to job for a while, and in one town I went to, someone mistook me for the other Brody. It was a simple mistake, but I figured that if I took the identity of my friend, the sheriffs would stop looking for me. I only planned to do it for a little while, but a month passed, then another, and it became easier to become him." "So you're not Brody Kinney?" Tilly whispered. Her eyes widened at the implication, and she turned to stare guiltily at Verity. "Was this all a lie?" she continued, looking back at Brody. "My real name is Brody Hamilton. My friend Billy was Brody Kinney. Your real nephew," he added, glancing in Verity's direction. Verity took a sip of her coffee, saying nothing, and Brody continued, his face flushed with guilt. "I figured it wouldn't do any harm taking on his name. Until one day, when I was working in Ohio, I received a letter from a Mr. Layton in New York requesting the presence of Brody Kinney at a meeting." He looked shamefaced. "When I heard about Buckthorn Ranch and how you wanted it to be farmed properly to continue your legacy, Verity, it was so like the promise I made to my pa all those years ago that it felt like some sort of sign. I deluded myself that even though I couldn't fulfill my pa's wishes, perhaps I could fulfill Billy's dream of having his own ranch and your wishes instead. I told myself I would just travel out here to have a look, maybe to become your ranch hand. I've struggled with my conscience every day since then, but now I can't lie to you all anymore. I know you'll ask me to leave immediately, Verity, and I also know I don't deserve your love, Tilly." He jumped up and started pacing back and forth. "But what about our marriage?" Tilly gasped. "I thought I loved you, Brody, and that you had feelings for me too. Did I imagine all that? Was it a lie?" "No," Brody's voice sounded strangled with emotion. "You all deserve better than me. Verity, I expect you could find a good buyer for the ranch. Tilly, you deserve a husband who didn't make the sort of choices I have. And Nancy, I'm sorry for everything." Before Tilly could say another word, Brody strode toward the door and snatched up his hat and coat. "I don't expect forgiveness, not from any of you. I should never have done what I did, but I promise I tried my best for your nephew, Verity. Your Brody was a good man. That part was completely true. I'm going to spend the night out checking the fences, and I'll stay on and work, sleeping in the barn until you decide what you want to do with the place, Verity. I owe you that much, at least, and when I've saved up the money, I'll repay what Mr. Layton gave me. And Tilly, I will tell Mr. Green to dissolve our marriage as soon as I can get into town." "Wait." Tilly jumped up from the table and started to run after him. But Brody just shook his head and hurried out into the dark night, leaving them all in stunned silence. Chapter 11. Rocky River, Wyoming. Tilly's eyes felt gritty with tiredness as she stood on the veranda the following morning. She had spent the night tossing and turning under the patchwork quilt, with Brody's words still ringing in her ears, until finally drifting into a fitful doze just before sunrise. It had felt like the longest night of her life as she tried to untangle her emotions. Do I still love him? Can there be any sort of future for us? The questions clouded her thoughts, leaving little room to appreciate the fact that it was Christmas Eve and the rising sun had painted the sky in streaks of pale pink and gold. "Do you think we should still celebrate Christmas?" Nancy asked behind her. She handed Tilly a tin mug of tea and sighed, looking crestfallen. "I still like Brody. Is it wrong of me?" Tilly shrugged, almost at a loss for words. She felt the same way and didn't have any answers. It looked as though it was out of her hands anyway. Brody had decided he would dissolve the marriage, and no doubt he would leave Rocky River and be on his way at the earliest opportunity. "I think we should, for Verity's sake," she said after a moment. She didn't have to add that it might be Verity's last Christmas. Nancy returned to the kitchen to start cooking a hearty breakfast, but Tilly lingered on the veranda. Even though she and Brody had never been together physically, in the true sense of being man and wife, she had missed his solid presence next to her in their bed during the night. But I married for convenience, knowing that he was doing it to secure inheriting the ranch from Verity. Doesn't that make me as complicit in the deception as Brody? Tilly inwardly wrestled with the thorny question for a moment longer, but no answer was forthcoming. She heard Verity's voice in the kitchen chatting with Nancy and felt a curl of regret in her stomach. She was genuinely fond of the old lady. In fact, she had grown to see her as the mother figure she had never had in her life. But all that would come to an end shortly. There would be no reason for her and Nancy to remain at Buckthorn Ranch if Verity decided to sell up, which was the only option Tilly could now imagine. Her only hope was that she might still see Verity in town if she and Nancy decided to find employment in Rocky River, if she even wants us to remain as friends. In the distance, Tilly could see Brody carrying hay out to the cattle in the paddocks closest to the homestead. They charged toward the fence, eager for the food, and she couldn't help but smile. He loved this place, and for a dizzying few seconds, she wanted to run across the snowy yard and throw herself into his arms to show him how much she cared about him. But he would probably just push her away. He had looked so determined last night as he strode away from her that she knew his mind was made up. She turned to go back inside with a heavy heart, but just at that moment the drum of hoofbeats reached her ears. Tilly looked down the hill and was surprised to see a man on horseback approaching. The horse was kicking up snow in its wake, and she felt a ripple of unease. What was so urgent that someone would be galloping here so early in the day and on Christmas Eve, she wondered. "I'm here to see Mrs. Clay." It was Mr. Green, the lawyer from Rocky River. He dismounted from his horse and threw the reins over a hitching post. His expression was stern, and he didn't bother with any pleasantries as he came up the steps onto the veranda. "I have information that she needs to hear immediately." He gave Tilly a look that made it clear he expected her to comply. "Who is it? Did I hear someone say my name?" Verity hobbled out onto the veranda and paused for a moment to drink in the view. "What a glorious morning." "The Lord is certainly showing us his glory today. What brings you out here the day before Christmas, Mr. Green? It must be something urgent." "I have something you're going to want to hear," he replied officiously. "Information about the future of your ranch," he added, puffing out his chest, full of his own importance. Tilly noticed he seemed rather irritated that Verity wasn't in such a hurry as he was as she breathed in the crisp air and watched Brody. He was walking through the cattle as he did every day, and every so often he paused to run his hand over their backs to check they were in good health. "Would you like to have a cup of coffee while you tell us this important news?" Verity asked with the hint of a smile. "Nancy has just made some. Why don't you come inside?" She turned to Tilly. "You'd better fetch Brody in for some breakfast. You know how he forgets to eat when he's busy with the stock." "I'm not sure you'll want him to hear what I have to say," Mr. Green interjected. "I don't keep any secrets from Brody and Tilly," Verity said mildly. As if to underline who was in charge, she raised her cane and waved it to catch Brody's eye. "Come in and eat, Brody," she called. "Nancy's made your favorite eggs and bacon." Brody waved back to show that he had heard, and Mr. Green harumphed, clearly annoyed. "Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you." Once Mr. Green was settled at the table and Verity was looking at him attentively, he pulled a letter out of his pocket and glanced at it quickly as though to prepare himself. He cleared his throat. "This is going to come as a shock to you, Mrs. Clay, but the man claiming to be your nephew is a fraud. I've made a few inquiries, and it turns out you've been harboring a man who's wanted by the law, a Mr. Brody Hamilton. They share the same first name, but there the resemblance ends." Tilly felt the blood drain from her face. Why had the lawyer made it his business to find this out? Brody was still taking his boots off near the door, but she could tell that he had heard every word as well. Before anyone could say anything, Mr. Green continued. "Mr. Brody Hamilton is wanted for playing a part in the theft of cattle with a gang of cattle rustlers. It so happens that the man he used to work for in Kansas is an acquaintance of mine, and he's convinced it was Brody Hamilton who told the cattle rustlers where they could ambush the men on a cattle drive to steal the beasts. He paused to let his words sink in and glanced in Brody's direction. Apparently, this fraudster claimed to have nothing to do with it. He even peddled some preposterous idea that he was trying to save your nephew's life after he got injured in a gunfight. But I don't believe a word of it. The man's a crook, and the only reason he's here is to trick you into parting with your ranch. Goodness me, that's quite a claim you're making, Verity said. She folded her hands on top of the table and gave the lawyer a shrewd look. It's lucky you're looking out for my best interests, Mr. Green. Exactly, he replied, nodding his head. He smiled ingratiatingly at Verity. I came here the moment I found out. So what do you think I should do? Verity's expression was inquisitive, and Tilly found herself holding her breath, terrified that a bad situation was about to get even worse. I'm glad you asked. Mr. Green pulled out another document and smoothed it out on the table before reaching into his pocket again for a fountain pen. I know you've suffered from ill health recently, and I'm sure you'll want to know that the ranch will be protected from fraudsters like him. I'd like to make you an offer to buy the place. I know the value of land around here, and you'll see I'm suggesting a very fair price. He pushed the document toward her and uncapped the pen, ready for her to sign it. Wait, Brody couldn't keep quiet any longer. I think you need more time to think about this, Verity. Mr. Green isn't a rancher, he's a lawyer. Would he care for Buckthorn Ranch the way you and Lenny wanted? Mr. Green shot Brody a venomous look. I hardly think you're in any position to advise Mrs. Clay. You're a wanted criminal. I didn't have anything to do with the cattle rustlers, Brody replied. He hurried to the table and gave Verity a beseeching look. I'm not saying this to make you change your opinion of me or persuade you to sell the place to me, Verity. I couldn't afford to buy the ranch anyway, but I can help you find a buyer who will farm it how you'd want before I leave. Someone who understands livestock and will continue Lenny's good work. She doesn't have time for that, Mr. Green spluttered, glaring at Brody in outrage. The old woman's practically dying, and if the ranch isn't sold, it will just be donated to the community. What sort of foolish idea is that? I'll find a ranch hand to look after the animals, if that's what it takes. Tilly stepped forward. That's no way to speak about Verity, she snapped. You're a very rude man, Mr. Green, and I won't stand for the way you're behaving. You can't bully her into selling the ranch to you, and I think you should allow her some time to think about your offer and make her own mind up. Verity shot Tilly and Brody a grateful smile. Thank you, my dears. I knew I could rely on you to help me. You'd choose the advice of a criminal and an ignorant orphan who used to work in a saloon, entertaining all sorts of men for money, no doubt, instead of accepting my excellent offer to buy this ranch, Mr. Green spluttered. It's not as if Buckthorn Ranch is even that special. The land is mediocre, and the barns have seen better days. You won't get another offer as good as mine, I can tell you. Tilly's cheeks burned with shame at the reference to her past. Clearly, the lawyer had been digging up information about her as well. How dare you speak about Tilly like that? Brody growled, clenching his fists defensively. He leaned over the table. That's my wife. You're insulting. You'd better apologize, or we can take this outside and sort it out like real men. Mr. Green stood up abruptly. Actually, you're not married, he sneered. It was a false ceremony, just to keep the old woman happy while I looked into your background because I had my suspicions about you from the first time we met. And it's a good thing I did, huh? Because when I leave here, I'll tell Sheriff Jackson in town to come and get you and throw you in jail until you can be sent back to Kansas to pay for your crimes. That's enough, Verity cried. She banged her cane on the floor with a sharp crack and slowly got to her feet. Do you take me for a fool, Mr. Green? I might be old, but I'm not stupid. I've known for weeks that Brody here is not my real nephew, and don't bother speaking to Sheriff Jackson. He already told me that Brody has been cleared of all the accusations to do with cattle rustling. They arrested one of the other men, and he confessed to everything. Brody and Tilly looked at each other with shock. They had taken Verity into town a few times when she said she had errands to run, but she had never hinted at anything about these revelations. It must be a lie. But even if it's true, why would you let a fraud carry on working for you? Mr. Green said, shaking his head in disbelief. Brody's no fraud, Verity said firmly. He's just a young man who got caught up in the dream of wanting to honor his pa's dying wish. He made some mistakes, but don't we all? I've seen the passion and determination that he has to make the best of Buckthorn Ranch, and how he cares for the people he loves. He's exactly the sort of person I would have wished to have as a son. But he's not even married, Mr. Green yelled. His face was red with anger. And she's as much of a liar as he is. It's shameful, he added, gesturing at Tilly with scorn written all over his face. If anyone should be ashamed of what's happened, it's you, Mr. Green, Verity said forcefully. You let this couple believe that they were married in the eyes of the Lord just to gain yourself some time to try and buy my ranch. I've heard the rumors in town that you've had your eye on the place for years, and you probably thought I would be too weak to resist your devious ways now that I'm a widow. She chuckled with a wry smile. You picked the wrong person to underestimate. I believe you could lose your license to practice law for falsifying a wedding, if I chose to tell anyone. Maybe Sheriff Jackson would be interested to know what you've been up to? You've gotten this all wrong, Mr. Green blustered. It was an honest mistake. I only found out afterward that my friend wasn't a proper pastor yet. Won't you consider my offer, Mrs. Clay? His voice had a wheedling tone to it, and he gave her another integrating smile. Let's all calm down and start over. Perhaps I could employ Brody to manage the ranch if that's what you want. Verity chuckled again and shook her head. You're persistent, I'll give you that, John. But I'm afraid you're too late. I already amended my will with the other lawyer in town. Brody and Tilly are inheriting my ranch, and that's the end of it. But they're not married, Mr. Green said again, refusing to back down. A moment later, his shoulders slumped, and he scowled. You'll regret this, I'm telling you. They're not the sort of people you can trust. I trust them more than I trust you, Verity shot back. I've seen the kind of people they are with my own eyes. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like you to leave. We have a proper wedding to plan. She picked up her cane and hobbled past Tilly and Brody with a twinkle in her eye to open the front door. It's snowing again, so you'd best be on your way, Mr. Green. We'll keep your misdemeanor to ourselves as long as you treat us with the respect we're due. John Green knew when he was beaten. He jammed his hat on and snatched up the document, stuffing it back in his pocket. Good day, Mrs. Clay, he mumbled. Merry Christmas. Verity called as they all stood on the veranda and watched him ride away. See you in church, no doubt. As the hoofbeats finally receded into the distance, Verity sighed happily and then turned to look at Tilly and Brody, who were both still in shock. I meant every word I said in there, she told them. But you knew about me all this time? Brody couldn't hide his surprise any longer. And you let me stay? I like to judge folks by their actions, Verity said softly. Sure, I made some inquiries, and Sheriff Jackson told me that it's true. You did try to save my nephew's life. I'll always be grateful to you for that. As for the rest of it, I knew you'd tell us eventually. You just needed a bit of time to reach that conclusion yourself. I'm truly sorry, Verity, Brody said. I should have been honest right from the start to you and Tilly. Verity shook her head. We all make the wrong choice sometimes, Brody. But I saw you praying plenty of times for the Lord's help, and I knew your heart was in the right place. Your pa would have been very proud of the man you've become. Tilly's eyes welled up with tears at Verity's words, and she slipped her hand into the crook of Brody's arm. Verity's right, she told him. You're the kindest man I've ever met. Verity shuffled away back into the cabin and closed the door softly behind her to give them some privacy. I don't deserve to have such wonderful people in my life, Brody said. His voice was husky with emotion, and he took both of Tilly's hands in his own. I've wanted to tell you for so long how much I love you, Tilly. A smile played on Tilly's lips, and her green eyes sparkled. I think I could tell when you kissed me. It's just a shame that we're not married. Would you let me put that right, please? Brody's eyes glinted with amusement, and then passion. Can we find the proper pastor, and will you become my wife, Tilly? For real this time. I can't think of anything that would make me happier, Tilly whispered. She closed her eyes as their lips met in a tender kiss, and she felt as though her heart was overflowing with joy. She had loved him since leaving New York, and now she didn't have to keep it secret for a moment longer. Let's hope the pastor can fit us in as soon as possible, Brody said a minute later as Tilly leaned her head against his shoulder and they stood looking out across the snowy landscape. Suddenly, the door opened behind them again, and Nancy came running out. Verity said the pastor often performs weddings before the Christmas Day service. How about getting married tomorrow morning? I could ride into town shortly and ask him. Verity appeared behind Nancy, her face wreathed in smiles. It's not unusual for us to get snowed in after Christmas and end up stuck on the ranch. What do you think? A Christmas Day wedding? Tilly replied. It sounds like a true miracle and the most perfect idea I've ever heard. Epilogue. Rocky River, Wyoming. December, 1 year later. A few snowflakes were just starting to drift down from the gray clouds as Tilly and Brody came out of the church, with Nancy not far behind them. What a wonderful service, Tilly said happily. A chance to see all our friends and remember the true meaning of the festive season. The pastor came over and shook Brody's hand. I'm glad you were able to make it into town. I was worried we wouldn't get many folks in the congregation after all the snow we've had in the last few weeks. We wouldn't have missed it for the world, Pastor Franklin. Brody looked proudly down at Tilly and their baby in her arms. It's 1 year ago today that you married us, and now we're lucky enough to have baby Marion, too. It's only fitting that we would come and worship on today of all days to give thanks for all the many blessings in our lives. Glad to hear it, the pastor said jovially, peering over the edge of Marion's shawl. She's a sweet little thing. It's always good to know that we have upstanding folks raising their families in Rocky River and contributing to our community. Tilly rocked Marion gently. It was kind of you to involve us in the harvest supper, Pastor. I hope the beef stew went down well. Brody's building up the herd, and we've just started shipping our beef back east. It's an exciting time for the ranch. Everyone said it was delicious. He drifted away to talk to more of his flock, and Tilly waved at Suzanne and Eli, who were just ahead of them. Are you staying for the carol singers? Suzanne asked. We're full up at the Rosebush Inn, so we'll be going back straight afterward to serve Christmas dinner to all our guests. Brody nodded. Nancy's singing with them, so we're looking forward to it. How's Mrs. Clay doing? I heard she took a turn for the worse. Eli looked concerned, hoping it wouldn't be bad news. Brody smiled. It was touch and go when she had influenza, but Tilly and Nancy nursed her through it. She's a little frail, but in good spirits, and the doctor said that with rest and good food, she should make a full recovery. Thank goodness for that. Eli hurried after his wife, who had walked on ahead, deep in conversation with Sheriff Jackson. That was an uplifting sermon from the pastor today, don't you think? The voice behind them was unforgettable, and Tilly turned around to see Mr. Green, who lifted his hat in a greeting. I need to give you this letter. It's from the sheriff in Kansas where you used to work, confirming that you were innocent of any involvement in the cattle rustling crime. He handed Brody the letter, looking apologetic. I wanted to be sure that you had it in writing to give you some peace of mind, he added. Also, I wonder if you could send my regards to Mrs. Clay. I'm glad to hear she's feeling better. Brody hesitated for a moment and then reached forward to shake Mr. Green's hand. Why don't you call in sometime for a cup of coffee? Verity always enjoys having visitors, and I can show you our new barn. I'd like that, Mr. Green said. The two men shared a look of understanding that the past was now behind them, and they were choosing forgiveness instead. I won't keep you. I'm helping Miss Brody from the school to give out the spiced fruit punch to raise money for a new classroom. We'll see you in the new year then, Tilly replied. Perhaps you could bring Miss Brody as well. The flush on Mr. Green's cheeks confirmed what she suspected. It seemed that the love of a good woman had helped him mend his ways. As they walked through the snowy streets of town toward the park, Tilly felt a sense of great peace fill her heart. Percent. Over the year they had been living at Buckthorn Ranch, she had grown to love Verity like a mother, and wasn't ready to lose her yet. Thankfully, Verity's strong-minded demeanor and faith had helped her pull through. "I'm not going anywhere, dear," she had wheezed, patting Tilly's hand late one evening after Tilly had helped her eat some chicken broth. "There's too much to look forward to. What, with all the plans Brody has for the beef herd and maybe another baby on the way next year?" Her eyes had twinkled with intrigue, making Tilly laugh. Nancy hurried ahead of them and took up her place with the carol singers next to the large Christmas tree, which had been erected at the center of the park. It was decked with tinsel and baubles, and there were dozens of candles flickering on the branches. "It's magical," Tilly said, looking up at Brody. "I wish Verity could have come with us to see it." "She told me she's determined to come next year," Brody chuckled. "Do you remember that fateful day when we first met by the coffee stall in 5 Points?" Tilly murmured. "It felt like a lifetime ago. So much has happened since then, it scarcely seems believable." Brody nodded and slipped his arm protectively around Tilly's shoulders. His heart swelled with love as he looked into her green eyes. And Marian gurgled happily from where she was swaddled in her shawl, looking up at him with eyes that were almost the same color. "You and Marian have made my life complete, Tilly," he said quietly. "I know it's hard work on the ranch, but I couldn't do it without you by my side." "Everything you do is for us to have a better life," Tilly replied. She tilted her head and rested it against Brody's shoulder as they watched Nancy and the other singers rustling their sheets of music and getting ready to sing. A moment later, the pure, sweet sound of their voices filled the air as they started to sing the first carol. Tilly felt overcome with emotion. It was exactly the sort of Christmas she had yearned for every year at St. Bartholomew's Orphanage, but had never believed would come true. She gazed up at Brody, knowing that he would understand, and he gave her a tender look. "Merry Christmas, Tilly. I love you." He brushed a kiss on her lips as the snowflakes drifted down over Rocky River. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.